You are watching a film when something strange happens. Not in the plot. The narrative continues normally, characters move and speak, but something shifts in the image itself. Time slows without stopping. A face holds for too long. The camera moves in a way that has nothing to do with what anyone sees or wants. The sensory motor link breaks. You cannot process what you are watching according to the usual schemas of recognition and response. The image presents itself directly, demanding thought rather than facilitating understanding. You are forced to think. This is the kind of encounter Gilles Deleuze believed begins philosophy. Not the gentle wonder of the Greeks, not the methodical doubt of Descartes, not the careful analysis of concepts already formed. Philosophy begins with violence, something from outside that cracks open habitual patterns that will not let you think what you already know how to think. An encounter with what cannot be recognized forces the creation of new concepts. Thought is not natural, it must be forced. Deleuze spent his career creating concepts, not discovering truths that were always there, not representing reality more accurately, not solving puzzles that had definite solutions. Creating. Philosophy for him was the art of forming, inventing, and fabricating concepts. The rhizome, the body without organs, the plane of immanence, the virtual and the actual, deterritorialization, becoming animal, the war machine, the time image. These are not descriptions of how things are. They are tools for making thought move differently. What does it mean to create a concept? It means giving consistency to something that does not yet exist in recognizable form. It means drawing connections that were not visible before. It means inventing ways of thinking that escape the gravitational pull of common sense, good sense, recognition, representation. A concept is not a mental representation that corresponds to an external object. A concept is an event in thought, a singularity that cuts across multiple domains, that makes new relations possible. Consider the concept of the rhizome. Deleuze and Guattari introduced it in the opening pages of 1,000 Plateaus to name a way of thinking that does not proceed from a central point outward, that has no hierarchy, no beginning, no end. A rhizome spreads horizontally, connects heterogeneous elements, breaks off and begins again elsewhere. Grass, not a tree. A multiplicity, not a unity. The rhizome is not found in nature and then applied to thought. The rhizome is created as a concept to make visible a different model of organization, connection, growth. Once created, it can be applied anywhere, to texts, to politics, to neural networks, to the internet before the internet existed. The concept has its own life. This is what distinguishes Deleuze from much of the philosophical tradition. Western philosophy has largely operated by representation. Thought mirrors the world, language corresponds to things, concepts refer to objects. Even when philosophers questioned correspondence, they often remained within the framework of representation, asking how thought relates to what it represents. Deleuze wanted to break with that framework entirely. Thought does not represent. Thought creates. Philosophy is not about truth in the sense of correspondence. It is about the invention of new ways of thinking, new orientations, new concepts that make the world thinkable differently. He called himself a pure metaphysician. This might seem odd given his suspicion of transcendence, his commitment to immanence, his interest in concrete practices and actual encounters. But metaphysics for Deleuze was not the study of being beyond appearances or the search for ultimate grounds. Metaphysics was the construction of concepts adequate to the movement of difference, to the production of the new, to becoming rather than being. His metaphysics was a metaphysics of difference, not identity, of multiplicity, not unity, of immanence, not transcendence, of the virtual that actualizes through differentiation, not the possible that becomes real without changing. Philosophy in the 20th century often turned against metaphysics, declaring it meaningless or impossible, or a confusion of grammar. Logical positivism reduced philosophy to the analysis of language. Ordinary language philosophy focused on how words are actually used. Phenomenology bracketed metaphysical questions to describe lived experience. Existentialism emphasized concrete human situations over abstract systems. Deleuze did not dismiss these movements, he learned from them, but he refused to abandon the ambition of philosophy to think being, time, difference, and multiplicity at the highest level of abstraction. He simply redefined what that ambition meant. His work is difficult. His prose is dense, technical, often deliberately disorienting. He invents vocabulary, repurposes terms from other fields, builds arguments that refuse linear development. Reading Deleuze requires sustained attention, tolerance for abstraction, willingness to encounter ideas that do not fit familiar frameworks. He does not make things easy, but the difficulty is not ornamental. The difficulty is essential to what he is trying to do. If thought must be forced, if philosophy is the creation of concepts that break with recognition, then philosophical writing cannot simply restate what is already known in clearer language. It must enact the violence of the encounter. Yet beneath the difficulty lies a vision of extraordinary clarity and consistency. Deleuze pursued the same set of problems throughout his career. How to think difference in itself, not difference subordinated to identity. How to think repetition as the production of the new, not the return of the same. How to think multiplicities that are not reducible to unities. How to think processes of becoming that are not anchored in fixed beings? How to think a life, impersonal and singular, that exceeds the individual subject? How to think immanence without any recourse to transcendence? These questions animate everything he wrote. His method was to read other philosophers not as authorities to be explained or debunked, but as interlocutors in the construction of concepts. He wrote books on Hume, Bergson, Nietzsche, Spinoza, Kant, Leibniz, Foucault. But these were not neutral commentaries. He called it philosophical buggery, taking a thinker from behind and producing a monstrous offspring that is both recognizably descended from the original and utterly new. His Nietzsche is not the Nietzsche of German scholarship. His Bergson is not the Bergson of academic histories. His Spinoza is not the Spinoza of Spinoza studies. Yet in each case he found something genuinely there, resources for thinking difference and multiplicity that the tradition had overlooked or suppressed. From Hume he took a radical empiricism that finds relations outside the terms related, that sees habit and belief as productions of the imagination rather than results of rational inference. From Bergson he took duration as the continuous differentiation of the virtual, memory as coexisting with the present, the élan vital as creative evolution, not teleological development. From Nietzsche he took the eternal return as the affirmation of difference, the will to power as the differential element of forces, the critique of reactive thought and ressentiment. From Spinoza he took the plane of immanence with no outside, the ethics of joyful and sad affects, the understanding of bodies as capacities to affect and be affected. From Kant he took the transcendental method while rejecting the transcendental subject, finding conditions of real experience rather than possible experience. From Leibniz he took the fold, the monad as point of view on the world, the virtual as fully real but not actual. Each encounter produced concepts that Deleuze carried forward into his own work. The virtual and the actual come from Bergson. The eternal return and active affirmation come from Nietzsche. The plane of immanence and the composition of affects come from Spinoza. But in Deleuze's hands, these concepts are transformed, combined, put to work in new contexts. He was not an historian of philosophy. He was a philosopher who used the history of philosophy as a laboratory for the creation of concepts. His collaboration with Félix Guattari, beginning in the late 1960s, intensified and expanded his project. Guattari brought clinical experience from working with psychotic patients at Laborde Clinic, political militancy from his involvement in radical psychiatry and post-1968 movements, and a different style of thinking, more associative, more diagrammatic, less systematically philosophical. Together they produced Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, the 2 volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, works that radicalized both psychoanalysis and Marxism by introducing concepts of desire, machines, assemblages, territorialization, and becoming. These books were events. They intervened in ongoing political and theoretical struggles with a violence and inventiveness that polarized readers. You could not be neutral about Anti-Oedipus. In his later work, Deleuze turned to cinema, producing 2 books that are among the most profound engagements with film as a mode of thought. He was not interested in film theory in the usual sense, semiotics of cinema, narrative structure, ideology critique. He wanted to know what cinema makes visible about time, movement, perception, and thought. What can cinema do that philosophy cannot? What concepts emerge from thinking through images rather than through language? The movement image and the time image are not film theoretical categories borrowed from elsewhere. They are concepts created to articulate what happens in certain kinds of cinematic images, what capacities they have, what relations they establish. His final collaborative work with Guattari, What is Philosophy?, attempted to define what they had been doing all along. Philosophy creates concepts. Science creates functions. Art creates percepts and effects. Each discipline thinks but differently. Philosophy is not superior to science or art, and it does not ground them. It has its own task, the construction of concepts on a plane of immanence. The book reads as a kind of testament, a summation of decades of conceptual work, a defense of philosophy's distinctiveness and necessity. Deleuze died in 1995, falling from the window of his Paris apartment. He had suffered from severe respiratory illness for decades, had lost a lung in 1968, and found breathing increasingly unbearable. His death was his own decision. He left behind a body of work that continues to provoke, disturb, inspire, and challenge readers across philosophy, politics, art, and cultural theory. His concepts have been taken up in fields he never wrote about directly: geography, architecture, music theory, literary studies, feminist theory, queer theory, new media studies. The Rhizome became an icon of networked thought before networks became ubiquitous. The body without organs circulated in subcultural spaces as a figure of resistance to normalization. Deterritorialization and reterritorialization entered the vocabulary of globalization studies. His work has been productively misunderstood, creatively appropriated, and sometimes reduced to slogans. But it has remained alive. What kind of thinker was Deleuze? A metaphysician who rejected transcendence, a systematic philosopher who wrote books without systematic structure, a rigorous conceptual architect who celebrated chaos and the outside, a solitary scholar who produced his most radical work in collaboration, a thinker committed to immanence who refused empiricist reductions, a philosopher of difference who built an entire metaphysical edifice, a critic of recognition who demanded that thought be forced by encounters, a creator of concepts who insisted that philosophy is not about opinions, but about invention. To enter his work is to risk disorientation. The familiar landmarks of philosophical argument, definitions, proofs, refutations, systematic development often seem absent. Instead, there are diagrams, plateaus, assemblages, lines of flight. There are concepts that proliferate and mutate, that appear in different registers across different texts. There are sudden moments of clarity surrounded by passages of extreme density. There is always movement. Deleuze's prose moves, his concepts move, his readings of other philosophers make them move. Nothing stays still long enough to be simply recognized. But this movement is not arbitrary. It follows the logic of difference and becoming, the logic of the virtual actualizing through divergent paths, the logic of multiplicities irreducible to unities. Once you learn to think with Deleuze rather than simply about him, once you let the concepts work on you rather than trying to master them, the movement becomes navigable. You begin to see why the rhizome cannot be explained with a tree structure, why the body without organs requires a certain violence of language, why the plane of immanence has no outside that would allow you to step back and survey it objectively. The difficulty is the content. This exploration will attempt to make Deleuze accessible without flattening him, to guide you into his world without pretending it is simpler than it is. It will trace the formation of his thought through his early readings of other philosophers, follow the development of his major concepts through his independent works and his collaborations with Guattari, examine his philosophy of cinema and his final reflections on what philosophy is, and close with the concept that organizes everything, the plane of immanence. Each chapter will serve a distinct purpose. Each will present material you will not encounter again in the same form. The goal is not to explain Deleuze away, but to bring you to the threshold of understanding, to give you enough that you could read him yourself and find the concepts already familiar, already working in your thought. The opening question remains: what does it mean to encounter thought? What does it mean to be forced to think? Deleuze's answer is that thought is not the natural exercise of a faculty that tends toward truth. Thought is what happens when something from outside, an image, a sensation, a problem, a text, strikes you in a way that cannot be assimilated to what you already know. Recognition fails. The categories break down. You must create new concepts to think what is forcing itself on you. Philosophy begins there, in that moment of forced creation. Everything else is conversation. Gilles Deleuze was born on January 18, 1925, in the 17th arrondissement of Paris. His father was an engineer, politically conservative, a supporter of the right-wing movements that gained strength in France during the 1930s. His mother came from a family of more modest means. He had an older brother, Georges, and a sister, Denise. The family was nominally Catholic, but not particularly religious. Deleuze would later say that he was raised to distrust politics, to see political engagement as dangerous and naive. This background shaped his early disposition: cautious, private, focused on study rather than action. The war came when he was 14. The German occupation of Paris began in June 1940. Deleuze spent the war years in Paris, attending the Lycée Carnot and later the Lycée Henri IV. These were years of deprivation, danger, and moral compromise. The Vichy regime collaborated with Nazi Germany. Jewish students and teachers disappeared. Resistance was sporadic and dangerous. Deleuze did not join the resistance. He kept his head down, continued his studies, avoided political involvement. He would later express a kind of shame about this, not guilt exactly, since he was young and the choices were impossible, but a sense that he had remained passive when others acted. His brother Georges was not passive. Georges was involved in resistance activities. In 1943, he was arrested by the Gestapo. He was deported to Auschwitz. He died in transit, possibly on the train, possibly during the selection process immediately upon arrival. The exact circumstances of his death are not known. He was 20 years old. Deleuze rarely spoke about this. When he did, it was briefly, without elaboration, but the loss marked him. It established a silence at the centre of his life, a refusal to make his personal suffering into material for public discourse. After the liberation, Deleuze enrolled at the Sorbonne to study philosophy. This was a period of extraordinary intellectual ferment in Paris. Sartre and existentialism dominated. Merleau-Ponty was developing phenomenology in new directions. Camus had published The Stranger and the Myth of Sisyphus. The figure of the engaged intellectual, committed to political struggle, was everywhere. Deleuze's teachers included Georges Canguilhem, Maurice de Gandillac, Ferdinand Alquier, and Jean Hippolyte. These were serious scholars, rigorous in their approach to the history of philosophy, less interested in contemporary fashions than in the careful reading of canonical texts. Deleuze turned away from existentialism and phenomenology. He found Sartre's focus on consciousness, freedom, and commitment unconvincing. Existentialism seemed to him still trapped in the categories of the subject, still operating within a humanist framework that philosophy needed to escape. Phenomenology's commitment to describing lived experience seemed to miss the impersonal, pre-subjective processes that interested him. He looked elsewhere, to the history of philosophy, to thinkers who had been marginalized or misread, to problems that could not be reduced to the question of human existence and meaning. He studied Hume intensely. His first published book, Empiricism and Subjectivity, appeared in 1953 when he was 28. It was a study of Hume's theory of human nature and the passions, but already it was not conventional scholarship. Deleuze found in Hume a radical empiricism that dissolved the subject into a bundle of perceptions held together by habit, that saw relations as external to their terms, that made belief and knowledge effects of the imagination rather than exercises of reason. The book announced themes that would remain central: multiplicity instead of unity, relations instead of substances, production instead of representation. He began teaching in French lycées in the early 1950s, first in Amiens, then in Orléans, then at the Lycée Louis-le-Grand in Paris. He was a teacher of secondary school students for nearly a decade. This was not unusual in France. Many important philosophers supported themselves through lycée teaching while producing their major works. Deleuze was a good teacher, careful in his presentations, demanding but not severe. He prepared his lessons meticulously. He thought teaching philosophy to adolescents required a different approach than university lectures, more concrete, more immediate, less technical. The discipline shaped his writing. Even his most difficult texts retain a pedagogical dimension, a sense that the concepts must be constructed step by step, that the reader must be brought along. In 1957, he was appointed to the Sorbonne as an assistant, escaping the lycée system. He published studies of Bergson, Nietzsche, and Kant in quick succession. Bergsonism in 1966, Nietzsche and philosophy in 1962. These were not dissertations but books, substantial works that established him as a serious scholar with distinctive readings of major figures. The book on Nietzsche was particularly influential. It appeared at a moment when Nietzsche was still under suspicion in France, tainted by Nazi appropriation, read primarily as an irrationalist or proto-fascist. Deleuze's reading was different. He presented Nietzsche as a thinker of affirmation, of difference, of the overcoming of reactive forces and ressentiment. He connected Nietzsche to Spinoza and Bergson, constructing a lineage of immanent, affirmative philosophy. The book changed how a generation of French intellectuals read Nietzsche. In 1964, he married Fanny Grandjoin, known as Fanny. She was a translator. They had 2 children, Julien and Émilie. Deleuze kept his family life private, separate from his philosophical work. He did not write about marriage or fatherhood. He did not make his personal experiences into material for philosophical reflection. This privacy was deliberate. He believed that a philosopher's life should be the concepts they created, not the biographical events that might or might not have occasioned those concepts. A life measured by what it produced in thought, not by what happened to the body. In 1968, everything changed, though not in the ways that changed for many others. May 1968, the student uprising, the general strike, the occupation of the Sorbonne, the near toppling of de Gaulle's government. Deleuze was 43, not a student, not a militant. He was recovering from surgery. Earlier that year, he had developed severe respiratory problems, tuberculosis complicated by other conditions, and had lost a lung. He spent May in the hospital, not on the barricades. But the events transformed the intellectual landscape. They created space for new forms of political thought, new alliances between theory and practice, new questions about desire, power, and social organization. Deleuze defended his doctoral thesis in 1969, Difference and Repetition, his first major independent work. The thesis was enormous, technically demanding, dense with arguments about ontology, epistemology, and the history of philosophy. The defense was formal, traditional. Deleuze presented his work to a jury that included established figures in French philosophy. They awarded him the doctorate. But the book itself was anything but traditional. It was a systematic work that attacked systematicity, a book about difference that refused to subordinate difference to identity, a metaphysics that rejected transcendence. It appeared in the same year as Logic of Sense, making 1969 an extraordinary moment of productivity. That same year, he met Félix Guattari. Guattari was younger, a psychoanalyst and political activist, working at the experimental psychiatric clinic La Borde under the direction of Jean Houry. He was involved in radical politics, had participated in May 68, moved in different circles than Deleuze. Not the university, but the clinic. Not scholarship, but militancy. They were introduced by a mutual acquaintance. They began talking. The conversations became collaborations. By 1972, they had written Anti-Oedipus together, a book that fused Deleuze's philosophical concepts with Guattari's clinical and political experience, producing something neither could have written alone. In 1969, Deleuze was appointed to the new experimental university at Vincennes, created in the aftermath of May 68 to accommodate the expanded student population and to allow for more radical pedagogical approaches. Vincennes was chaotic, underfunded, politically intense. Classes were massive, overcrowded, often disrupted by political actions. Deleuze taught courses on the history of philosophy, Spinoza, Leibniz, Hume, but always with a slant, always constructing concepts through the readings. His lectures attracted students from across disciplines, not just philosophy majors, but filmmakers, artists, political militants. He lectured in a quiet voice, coughing frequently because of his damaged lungs, pausing to catch his breath. The lectures were rigorous but also improvisational, following the movement of ideas rather than predetermined outlines. In 1987, he retired from teaching due to declining health. His respiratory problems had worsened progressively. Breathing was difficult, often painful. He could no longer lecture without severe discomfort. He withdrew to his apartment on the Avenue Niel in Paris, where he had lived for decades. He continued to write, to read, to think. He worked on the cinema books, on What is Philosophy, on essays and interviews. But he was increasingly isolated, limited by the body's failing capacity. His later years were productive intellectually, but constricted physically. He gave few interviews. He rarely appeared in public. He corresponded with friends and colleagues, but declined most invitations. He was not reclusive by temperament. He enjoyed conversation, valued friendship, but the illness made normal social life impossible. He became what he had always somewhat been, a solitary thinker, working through problems alone, constructing concepts in the privacy of his study. He said once that a philosopher's biography should consist of the rendezvous, the encounters that changed their thinking. Not the chronology of life events, but the moments when thought was forced to move differently. For Deleuze, those encounters were primarily with texts, reading Hume, Bergson, Nietzsche, Spinoza. Then the encounter with Guattari, which produced a new kind of writing, a new voice. Then the encounters with cinema, with Bacon's paintings, with Proust's prose, with the problems that demanded new concepts. The rest, where he lived, whom he married, what positions he held, was incidental. This creates a problem for biography. How do you narrate a life that deliberately withdrew from incident, that measured itself by concepts rather than events? You can recount the facts. Born 1925, educated at the Sorbonne, taught in lycées and universities, wrote 25 books, died 1995. You can note the historical context, the war, the occupation, the post-war intellectual scene, May 68. You can describe his working methods, his friendships, his temperament. But the real life, the life that mattered philosophically, was the movement of thought through problems, the creation of concepts adequate to difference and multiplicity, the sustained engagement with the question of immanence. Deleuze died on November 4, 1995. He was 70 years old. He fell from the window of his apartment. The fall was not an accident. His respiratory illness had become unbearable. He could not breathe without pain. He had refused mechanical assistance, refused hospitalization. He chose the moment and the means. His wife Fanny found him. There was no note, no explanation. The act spoke for itself. A refusal of suffering that served no purpose. A decision made with clarity about what his life had become and what it could not continue to be. The obituaries struggled to summarize his work. Some emphasized the political radicalism of Anti-Oedipus, others the systematic ambition of difference and repetition, others the cinematic innovations of the two cinema books. Some presented him as a post-structuralist, though he disliked the term. Some connected him to postmodernism, though his work had little in common with the celebration of fragmentation and play that characterized much postmodern theory. Some called him a vitalist, a Nietzschean, a Spinozist, a Bergsonian. All of these labels captured something while missing the whole. He was a philosopher who created concepts, who thought difference and multiplicity through to their consequences, who built a metaphysics of immanence without transcendence, who made thought move. The life without incidents ended. The concepts remained. Deleuze's early work consisted of studies of other philosophers. Between 1953 and 1969, he published substantial books on Hume, Bergson, Nietzsche, Kant, and Spinoza, along with a monograph on Proust. These were not conventional scholarly commentaries. They were creative engagements, philosophical appropriations, what Deleuze himself called acts of philosophical buggery, taking a thinker from behind and producing a monstrous offspring that belongs both to the original and to something new. The metaphor is deliberate, provocative, slightly scandalous. It suggests that Deleuze's readings were not respectful interpretations aimed at recovering what a philosopher really meant. They were productive encounters aimed at making the philosopher speak differently, extracting resources for problems the original thinker never explicitly addressed. This was not misreading in the sense of getting things wrong. It was creative reading, using the history of philosophy as a laboratory for the construction of concepts. Start with Hume. Empiricism and Subjectivity appeared in 1953 as Deleuze's first published book. Hume is not typically considered a major metaphysician. He is known for skeptical arguments against causation, against the self, against induction that seem to limit what philosophy can know. But Deleuze found something else in Hume, a radical empiricism that dissolves substances into relations, that makes the subject an effect rather than a ground, that sees knowledge and belief as products of imagination and habit rather than exercises of reason. Hume's famous claim, "The self is nothing but a bundle of perceptions. There is no underlying substance, no persisting identity, just a succession of impressions and ideas held together by principles of association, resemblance, contiguity, causation." For Hume, this was a skeptical conclusion about the limits of knowledge. For Deleuze, it was a positive ontological thesis. The self is not a given, it is produced. Subjectivity is an effect of processes that exceed it, the flow of perceptions, the operations of imagination, the establishment of habits. More radically, Hume treats relations as external to their terms. When we say A causes B, the relation of causation is not contained in A or B themselves. It is produced by the imagination through repeated experience of constant conjunction. The terms could exist without the relation is added. This externality of relations became crucial for Deleuze. If relations are external, then things are not internally determined by their place in a totality. They can enter new relations, form new assemblages, become different without ceasing to be what they are. Deleuze's Hume is a philosopher of immanence avant la lettre. There is no transcendent ground, no God, no necessary truths, no rational order underlying appearances. There is only the given, the manifold of impressions, and the processes by which imagination and habit organize the given into a world. The subject is not separate from this process, it is produced within it. Belief is not justified true knowledge, it is a habit of mind that allows practical action. Philosophy does not discover foundations, it describes how the world becomes thinkable through empirical processes. This reading prepared the way for Deleuze's later work, the dissolution of the subject, the externality of relations, the production of belief through habit, the immanence without transcendence. These became permanent features of his thought. Hume gave him a model of how to think genesis without presupposing what is generated, how to think production without invoking a producer. Bergson was more central. Deleuze published Bergsonism in 1966, a short book that transformed how Bergson was understood in France. Bergson had been influential in the early 20th century, but fell out of favour, dismissed as a vitalist mystic whose philosophy of intuition and élan vital belonged to a pre-scientific worldview. Deleuze's retrieval was not nostalgic. He presented Bergson as a rigorous thinker of difference, duration, and the virtual, whose concepts remained essential for any philosophy that wanted to think time, memory, and becoming. The key move was Bergson's distinction between the virtual and the actual. This was not the distinction between the possible and the real. The possible is defined as the not yet real. When it becomes real, it simply receives existence without changing its nature. The virtual is different. The virtual is fully real, but not actual. It is a field of potentials that actualizes through differentiation, producing the diverse actual things of the world. Actualization is not realization but creation. Bergson's primary example is duration. Duration is not the succession of discrete moments, not the time measured by clocks. Duration is the continuous interpenetration of past and present, the qualitative heterogeneity of lived time. The past does not cease to exist when the present arrives. The past coexists with the present, presses on it, conditions it. Memory is not stored in the brain as traces that are retrieved. Memory is the virtual past, always already there, actualizing in present perception and action. This gave Deleuze a model for thinking ontological difference, not the difference between being and beings, but the difference between the virtual and the actual as two modes of the real. The virtual is the condition of the actual, but it is not prior in time. They coexist. The virtual actualizes through divergent paths, through differentiation, producing the multiplicity of actual things without being exhausted by any actualization. This concept of the virtual runs through all of Deleuze's work, from difference and repetition through the cinema books. Bergson also gave Deleuze a method, intuition, but intuition for Bergson is not immediate insight or mystical vision. It is a rigorous philosophical method that involves dividing problems according to their natural articulations, discovering the right differences in kind rather than imposing differences of degree. Science tends to measure, to quantify, to find continuous variations between phenomena. Intuition finds the qualitative cuts, the points where things differ in kind rather than degree. Duration differs in kind from space, not just in degree. Memory differs in kind from perception. The virtual differs in kind from the actual. Deleuze's Bergson is a dualist, but not a dualist of mind and body or appearance and reality. A dualist of different ways the real can be. The actual and the virtual, space and duration, matter and memory, these are not two substances but two tendencies, two directions in which experience can be analysed. Philosophy's task is to think both and their relation without reducing one to the other. Nietzsche was decisive. Nietzsche and philosophy appeared in 1962 and remains one of the most influential interpretations of Nietzsche ever written. Deleuze encountered Nietzsche at a moment when French philosophy was dominated by Hegel, by dialectics, by the synthesis of opposites through negation. Nietzsche offered an alternative, a philosophy of affirmation, of difference, of forces rather than subjects, of becoming rather than being. The key concept Deleuze extracted was the will to power, not will in the psychological sense, desire, intention, agency. Will to power is the differential element in forces. Forces are always plural. They exist only in relation to other forces. A force is defined by what it can do, by its quantity and quality. The quantity is its power. The quality is whether it is active or reactive. Active forces affirm their own difference, create, expand. Reactive forces respond, adapt, conserve. The will to power is what determines which forces prevail in any given situation. Nietzsche's famous revaluation of values becomes in Deleuze's reading a typology of forces. Reactive forces dominate when they separate active forces from what they can do, when they turn force against itself, when they establish values of negation, guilt, and resentment. Slave morality is the morality of reactive forces. Master morality is the morality of active forces. But the distinction is not sociological or historical. It is ontological. It concerns how forces relate, whether they affirm or negate. The eternal return is reinterpreted radically. For Nietzsche, the eternal return is the thought that everything recurs exactly as it was. For Deleuze, this cannot mean the return of the same. If everything returned exactly, nothing would have changed. The eternal return must be selective. Only what affirms returns. Reactive forces, being essentially reactive, cannot affirm the eternal return. They negate, they resent, they want things to be different. Only active forces can affirm that everything returns. The eternal return is thus the test of affirmation. Can you will the return of this moment, exactly as it is, eternally? If yes, you affirm. If no, you remain reactive. This reading made Nietzsche usable for Deleuze's project. Nietzsche became the philosopher of difference rather than identity, of affirmation rather than negation, of forces rather than subjects, of becoming rather than being. Deleuze would return to Nietzsche throughout his career, using concepts like the eternal return, active and reactive forces, and the overman as resources for thinking difference, multiplicity, and the overcoming of dialectics. Spinoza was perhaps the most profound influence. Deleuze wrote 2 books on Spinoza, Spinoza and the Problem of Expression in 1968, and The Shorter Spinoza, Practical Philosophy in 1970. Spinoza gave Deleuze the concept of immanence in its most rigorous form. The ethics presents a world with no outside. God or nature, Deus sive natura, is not a creator separate from creation, but the single substance of which all things are modes. There is no transcendence, no hierarchy, no teleology. Everything that exists expresses the power of the one substance according to its degree of power. Spinoza's definition of things by their effects was crucial. A body is not defined by its form or function, but by what it can do, by its capacity to affect and be affected. Ethics is not about obeying moral laws or conforming to norms. It is about understanding what increases or decreases your power of acting, what compositions are joyful and what are sad. Joy is the passage to greater perfection, greater power. Sadness is the passage to lesser perfection, lesser power. The ethical question is, what are you capable of? Deleuze found in Spinoza a model of thought without judgment, without transcendence, without recourse to anything outside the immanent relations between bodies. He also found a logic of expression. For Spinoza, modes express the substance, attributes express the essence of substance, and substance expresses itself in and through modes and attributes. Expression is not representation. It is the process by which something makes itself present, by which the virtual becomes actual, by which power unfolds into diverse forms. The plane of immanence, Deleuze's most important concept, derives from Spinoza. Immanence means no outside, no transcendent ground or goal, no higher unity that would subsume differences. Everything is on the same plane. Differences are real, but they are differences on the plane, not differences between the plane and something beyond it. Philosophy, for Deleuze, constructs concepts on the plane of immanence. This means philosophy has no recourse to anything outside thought itself. No God, no subject, no transcendental conditions. Immanence all the way down. Kant might seem an odd choice for Deleuze, given Kant's commitment to transcendental conditions and the limits of knowledge. But Deleuze's Kant's critical philosophy, published in 1963, finds in Kant the method of transcendental inquiry, even while rejecting Kant's reliance on the transcendental subject. Kant asked, "What are the conditions of possible experience?" Deleuze radicalized this into, "What are the conditions of real experience?" Not what must be true for experience to be possible in general, but what processes generate the specific forms of experience we actually have. This shift from the possible to the real, from the conditions of all experience to the genesis of particular experiences, became central to Deleuze's method. He called it transcendental empiricism, a contradiction in terms by Kant's standards, but coherent for Deleuze. Empiricism because it begins with actual experience, not a priori structures. Transcendental because it seeks the conditions that generate experience, not just the contents of experience. The result is a philosophy that thinks genesis without presupposing what is generated, that finds the transcendental in the empirical rather than positing it as separate. Leibniz entered Deleuze's work later, but became increasingly important. The Fold, Leibniz and the Baroque appeared in 1988, near the end of Deleuze's career. Leibniz gave Deleuze the concept of the fold as an alternative to dialectical mediation. Instead of synthesis through negation, Leibniz offers infinite folding, the world enfolded in each monad, matter folded to infinity, the soul folded into pleats. The monad has no windows, it does not interact with other monads, but it expresses the entire world from its own point of view. This notion of point of view without a subject, of perspective without relativism, became crucial for Deleuze's late work. In each of these readings, Deleuze was constructing a lineage, a counter-tradition within philosophy, not Plato, Descartes, Hegel, the canonical figures of idealism, representation and dialectics, but Hume, Spinoza, Nietzsche, Bergson, thinkers of immanence, multiplicity, affirmation, difference. This was not antiquarian scholarship, it was the creation of resources for his own philosophical project. The method was consistent. Find what is genuinely new in a thinker, what breaks with the dominant assumptions of their time. Extract concepts that can be developed beyond their original context. Ignore aspects of the work that remain tied to old problems. Construct a reading that makes the thinker a collaborator in current philosophical work rather than an object of historical study. Produce something that is both faithful to the text, grounded in careful reading, and radically new. This is what Deleuze meant by philosophical buggery, not interpretation, but production. The offspring is monstrous because it does not look exactly like either parent. It belongs to the original thinker. Deleuze's Nietzsche is recognizably about Nietzsche, not Hegel or Heidegger. But it also belongs to Deleuze, to his problems, his concepts, his project. The reading creates something that did not exist before, neither in the original text nor in Deleuze's thought prior to the encounter. By 1968, when difference and repetition appeared, Deleuze had assembled the resources he needed. From Hume, the dissolution of the subject and the externality of relations. From Bergson, the virtual and the actual duration, the method of intuition. From Nietzsche, active and reactive forces, the eternal return, affirmation. From Spinoza, the plane of immanence, the ethics of affects, expression. From Kant, the transcendental method radicalized. From Leibniz, the fold point of view incompossibility. These were not influences in the sense of debts to be acknowledged. They were conceptual materials, tools, resources for the construction of a philosophy of difference. The early books were not preparation for the real work, they were the real work. Reading was already creation. The concepts Deleuze found in other philosophers were already his concepts, transformed through the encounter. When he began to write under his own name, in difference and repetition and logic of sense, he was not leaving behind the history of philosophy. He was bringing it forward, recombining it, putting it to work in new ways. The monstrous offspring had come into their own. Deleuze called this the dogmatic image of thought. It is dogmatic because it is presupposed without argument, taken as obvious, built into the structure of philosophical inquiry. The image of thought is not a doctrine that one philosopher or another defends. It is the unthought that makes their doctrines possible, the orientation that determines what questions can be asked and what answers seem plausible. The dogmatic image includes several postulates. First, that thought has a good nature and the thinker a good will. We naturally want to know, we naturally seek truth. Second, that thinking is recognition, applying concepts to objects, identifying what things are, bringing the unfamiliar under familiar categories. Third, that thought proceeds by representation, forming ideas that correspond to objects, constructing mental pictures that mirror reality. Fourth, that truth is the goal, the adequation of thought to its object, the correspondence of concept to thing. Fifth, that error comes from external causes. We would think correctly if only we avoided prejudice, passion, confusion. Nietzsche attacked these postulates. Not by refuting them, you cannot refute presuppositions that are not argued for, but by showing what they conceal, what forces they serve, what kinds of thought they exclude. The image of thought is not neutral. It privileges certain types of thinking, calm, rational, systematic, over others. It makes thought into an exercise of recognition rather than creation. It assumes that the thinker is already oriented toward truth rather than caught in struggle. For Nietzsche, thought is not naturally oriented toward truth. Thought is a field of forces, some active, some reactive. Active forces affirm, create, expand. Reactive forces negate, preserve, contract. Thought becomes an exercise of recognition when reactive forces dominate, when the new is reduced to the already known, when difference is subordinated to identity. But thought can also be active, affirmative, creative. It can make the new rather than recognizing the old. This means thought must be forced. It does not naturally seek truth. It must encounter something from outside that will not let it rest in its habitual patterns, that demands creation rather than recognition. Nietzsche's formula: what forces us to think? Not the love of wisdom, not wonder at the world, not methodical doubt, but a shock, a violence, an encounter with what cannot be assimilated. Deleuze took up this question as the guiding thread of his own work. If thought must be forced, then philosophy cannot begin with assumptions about what thought is or what it wants. It must begin with the event that makes thought happen, with the encounter that fractures habitual understanding. This is why Deleuze was suspicious of method in philosophy. Method assumes you already know how to think, that you just need to apply procedures correctly. But if thought is forced, then there is no method in advance. There is only the response to what forces thought. The attack on recognition is central. What is recognition? It is the coordination of faculties, perception, imagination, memory, understanding, around an object that they all grasp as the same. I see a tree. I remember having seen trees before. I understand the concept tree. I imagine what the tree might look like from another angle. All faculties work together harmoniously. The object is recognized as an instance of a type. Thought proceeds smoothly, but recognition leaves everything as it was. It applies pre-existing concepts to new instances. It subsumes difference under identity. This tree is recognized as another instance of the universal tree. It operates within the framework of common sense and good sense, within the distribution of competencies that determines what each faculty can do. Recognition is conservative. It maintains the world as already known. What would it mean for thought not to recognize? It would mean encountering something that exceeds the coordinates of the faculties, something that cannot be brought under familiar concepts, something that forces each faculty to its limit and beyond. Deleuze's example: the encounter with a work of art that does not represent anything but produces an effect. Artaud's theatre, Bacon's paintings, Resnais' films. You cannot recognize what you are experiencing. The usual schemas fail. You are forced to think, to create concepts adequate to the encounter. This is why Deleuze rejected the idea that philosophy begins with wonder. The Greeks made wonder the origin of philosophy. We wonder at the world, marvel at its order or strangeness, and this wonder motivates inquiry. But wonder is too gentle. It leaves the thinker in a contemplative relation to the world, admiring rather than struggling. Deleuze wanted something more violent. Philosophy begins not with wonder, but with a shock that disrupts, that will not let you think what you already know. The difference is crucial. Wonder preserves the image of thought as naturally oriented toward truth. We wonder because we want to understand. The world invites our inquiry. We respond with philosophy. But if thought must be forced, then the world is not initially intelligible. It presents problems that thought cannot solve with existing concepts. It forces the creation of new concepts, not the application of old ones. Nietzsche's eternal return functions in this context as a test. Can you affirm the return of everything exactly as it is, eternally? Most people cannot. They want things to be different. They regret the past, hope for a better future, imagine how things should have been. They live in negation, in the mode of reactive forces. The eternal return selects against them. Only those who can affirm the return, who can say yes to every moment, who can will that it return eternally, pass the test. And this affirmation is active, creative, world-making. Deleuze's reading makes the eternal return into an ontological principle rather than a cosmological doctrine. It is not a claim about the structure of time, that the universe cycles endlessly through the same states. It is a claim about what returns. Only difference returns. Only what affirms its own difference can return. The same, insofar as it depends on negating difference, cannot return because it has nothing of its own to affirm. The eternal return is thus the being of becoming, not a static being that is always the same, but a being that consists in the eternal return of difference. This transforms how we understand repetition. Normally, repetition means the return of the same day, the same routine, the same patterns. But for Deleuze, repetition is the production of the new. What returns is not the identical, but the differential. Each repetition differs from what came before. The eternal return is not eternal sameness, but eternal differentiation, the constant production of the new through repetition. The dice throw becomes Deleuze's figure for this. When you throw dice, the outcome is determined by chance. No skill, no control, no predetermination. Each throw is singular, unrepeatable. Yet the throw itself can be affirmed, can be willed to return. To affirm the dice throw is to affirm chance, to say yes to the random distribution of results without resentment or regret. The eternal return is the return of the throw, not the return of a particular number. What returns is the act of throwing, the affirmation of chance, the production of difference. Nietzsche also gave Deleuze the concept of active and reactive forces, which became the basis for a typology of thought. Active forces affirm their own difference. They create, they expand, they experiment. Reactive forces respond to what is external. They adapt, they conserve. In themselves, reactive forces are necessary. Every organism must respond to its environment. But when reactive forces dominate, when they turn force against itself, when they establish values that negate life rather than affirm it, then thought becomes reactive. Deleuze sees the history of philosophy as largely a history of reactive thought. Platonism negates the sensible world in favour of intelligible forms. Christianity negates earthly life in favour of heavenly salvation. Dialectics makes negation the motor of history. Phenomenology reduces the world to what appears for consciousness. Even empiricism, which should be affirmative, often reduces experience to subjective representations rather than affirming the real as it is encountered. Against this reactive tradition, Deleuze constructs a counter-tradition of active thought. Lucretius and the Clinamen, the swerve that introduces difference into the downward rain of atoms. Spinoza and the plane of immanence with no outside. Hume and the externality of relations. Nietzsche and the overman who affirms. Bergson and the élan vital. These are thinkers who affirm difference, who build concepts that enhance power rather than limit it, who think immanence rather than transcendence. The image of thought, then, is not something you can simply decide to abandon. It is embedded in language, in common sense, in the structure of concepts available for thinking. To create a new image of thought requires creating new concepts, new ways of thinking that do not rely on recognition, representation, identity. It requires philosophy as creation rather than discovery, as invention rather than analysis. Deleuze's Nietzsche and philosophy accomplished something rare. It changed how an entire generation read a major philosopher. Before Deleuze, Nietzsche in France was still marked by the Nazi appropriation, still read as an irrationalist critic of reason, still suspected of proto-fascism. Deleuze showed that Nietzsche could be read as a rigorous philosopher of difference, that his critique of morality was a critique of reactive forces and resentment, that his affirmation of life was an ontological principle rather than a biological vitalism. But more than that, the book established the terms for Deleuze's own project: the critique of representation, the emphasis on difference rather than identity, the model of active and reactive forces, the eternal return as selective repetition, the attack on the image of thought. These would recur throughout his work, in Difference and Repetition, in the Capitalism and Schizophrenia volumes with Guattari, in the Cinema books. Nietzsche was not just an influence, he was a collaborator, a fellow traveller in the construction of a philosophy adequate to difference, multiplicity, and becoming. The question remains, what forces us to think? Deleuze's answer shifts across his work, but always involves an encounter with the outside, with something that exceeds recognition. In Proust and Signs, it is the violent sign that forces interpretation, that will not let you rest in habit or memory. In Difference and Repetition, it is the encounter with intensities that cannot be reduced to qualities, with problems that demand solutions without already containing them. In Logic of Sense, it is the event that splits time, that creates a before and after. In the Cinema books, it is the time image that presents duration directly, that breaks the sensory-motor schema. In What is Philosophy? It is chaos, the formless, that demands the creation of concepts to give it consistency. But the structure is always the same. Thought does not begin with a willing subject who decides to think. It begins with something from outside that strikes, that forces, that will not be assimilated to what is already known. The task of philosophy is not to secure foundations or establish certainties. It is to respond to what forces thought, to create concepts adequate to the encounter. This is what Deleuze learned from Nietzsche. This is what made Nietzsche indispensable. In 1968, Deleuze defended his doctoral thesis, Difference and Repetition. It is the most systematic of his books, the most technically demanding, the most thoroughly engaged with the tradition of Western metaphysics. It is also the book where Deleuze stakes his claim most directly. Philosophy has subordinated difference to identity, and this subordination must be overturned. The argument begins with a problem. How do we think difference? The traditions answer, difference is difference between two things that are first identical in some deeper way. Two trees differ from each other, but they are both trees. They share the identity tree. Two shades of red differ, but they are both red. They share the identity red. Difference is thus relational, secondary, dependent on a prior identity. This means difference is always thought through identity. Aristotle's logic, a thing is defined by its genus and specific difference. The genus is the shared identity. The specific difference distinguishes one species from another within the genus. But the difference is always subordinated to the identity of the genus. Difference serves to divide and classify identities. It has no independence. Hegel's dialectics internalizes difference into identity. A thing is what it is only through negating what it is not. Identity includes difference as its internal moment. The synthesis overcomes the opposition, producing a higher identity that includes both. But again, difference is subordinated. It is the negative moment that will be sublated, aufgehoben, overcome in a more comprehensive unity. Difference serves the development of identity. It has no autonomy. Deleuze wants difference in itself. Not difference between two identities, but difference that is not relative to identity at all. Difference is the condition of identity rather than what is conditioned by it. Difference that produces identities rather than being distributed among them. This sounds paradoxical. How can you think difference without thinking different things? How can difference be primary if there is nothing yet to differ? The solution requires rethinking what difference is. Difference is not a relation between terms. It is the process of differentiation, the movement by which the virtual becomes actual, by which the one becomes many, by which problems generate solutions. Difference is production, not comparison. The virtual is key. The virtual is not the possible. The possible is defined as the not yet real. It has the same form as the real, just lacking existence. When the possible becomes real, it simply receives existence without changing. This model subordinates difference to identity. The possible and the real are identical except for existence. Deleuze rejects it. The virtual is fully real but not actual. It is a field of potentials, a structure of relations, a problem that contains no particular solution. The virtual actualizes through differentiation. It does not become real. It was always real. It becomes actual by diverging, by producing differences, by splitting into multiple lines of actualization. The actual things we encounter, organisms, individuals, identities, are solutions to virtual problems, actualizations of virtual structures. An example: the embryo. The fertilized egg is virtual in relation to the fully developed organism. It does not contain the organism in miniature, waiting to grow larger. It contains a genetic program, a field of potentials that will actualize through differentiation, cells dividing, differentiating into tissues, tissues organizing into organs, organs composing into systems. The organism is not preformed in the egg. It is produced through the differentiation of the virtual. Another example, the problem and its solutions. A mathematical problem, find the curve that satisfies these conditions, does not contain its solution as a possible waiting to be discovered. The problem has a structure, a set of relations that determines what would count as a solution. But the solutions are produced through the differentiation of the problem, through following out its implications in different directions. Multiple solutions can actualize the same problem. The problem is virtual. The solutions are actual. This is how Deleuze thinks difference in itself. Difference is not the difference between actual things. Difference is the process of differentiation by which the virtual produces the actual. It is internal to the virtual as its mode of actualization. It is ontologically prior to identity because identities are what result from differentiation, not what ground it. Repetition undergoes a parallel transformation. Normally, repetition means the return of the same word spoken twice, the same day repeated endlessly. But Deleuze distinguishes two kinds of repetition. There is bare or material repetition, the repetition of the identical, like factory products or ticks of a clock, and there is hidden or spiritual repetition, the repetition of difference, where each repetition produces the new. The eternal return is the model. What returns is not the same. What returns is the act of differing, the affirmation of chance, the production of the new through repetition. Each throw of the dice differs from every other, but the throwing itself recurs. Repetition is productive, not conservative. Deleuze connects this to the concept of intensity. Intensity is difference in itself. Not extensive difference, 2 meters versus 3 meters, but intensive difference. Hot versus cold, high versus low pressure. Intensive difference drives processes. Heat flows from hot to cold. Water flows from high pressure to low pressure. These flows tend to equalize, to cancel the differences that drive them. But before they cancel, they produce extensive quantities, the work done by a heat engine, the force of water through a pipe. Intensity is difference that differs from itself, difference that produces by cancelling itself. It is the virtual actualizing. The egg begins with intensive differences, gradients of chemical concentration that will direct the differentiation of cells. As these differences actualize, they produce the extensive qualified organism, the actual body with its organs and parts. But the intensive differences that drove the process are cancelled in the result. We see the organism, not the intensities that produced it. This makes intensity the transcendental principle of actual experience, not Kant's transcendental categories, unity, causality, substance, which are the conditions of possible experience. But intensity is the condition of real experience, the productive difference that generates the actual world. Deleuze calls this transcendental empiricism. It is empiricism because it begins with actual experience, with what is encountered. It is transcendental because it seeks the conditions that generate that experience, the intensive differences that actualize into extensive qualities. The book is dense with technical arguments drawn from the history of philosophy. Deleuze engages Plato on the simulacrum, Aristotle on categories, Leibniz on incompossibility, Kant on the synthesis of imagination, Hegel on contradiction, Heidegger on ontological difference. He constructs a metaphysics of difference that challenges the primacy of identity across the tradition. But the point is not simply to refute previous philosophers, it is to liberate difference from its subordination to identity, to think difference as productive rather than negative, to understand becoming as ontologically prior to being. This requires new concepts, the virtual and the actual, intensity, differentiation, repetition as production, the eternal return as selective principle. One of the book's most difficult sections concerns the three syntheses of time. Deleuze rereads Kant's three syntheses of apprehension, reproduction, and recognition, detaching them from the unity of the transcendental subject and reconstructing them as passive syntheses that produce time without a subject who synthesizes. The first synthesis is habit. Habit contracts the past into the present, making the succession of moments into a lived duration. When you learn to walk, each step contracts the memory of previous steps into a habitual pattern. The synthesis is passive. It happens in the body, not through a willing subject. Habit is the foundation of the living present. The second synthesis is memory. Memory preserves the past as past, not as something that has ceased to exist, but as a virtual coexistence with the present. Bergson's pure memory, the totality of the past, conditions every present moment. The synthesis again is passive. Memory is not something you do, but something that is always already there, a structure that precedes any act of recollection. The third synthesis is the future. Not the future as what will happen, but the future as the form of time itself, the empty form that conditions the possibility of change. Time is the form of inner sense, as Kant said, but for Deleuze, this means time is empty, formal, indifferent to what fills it. The third synthesis breaks the continuity of time, introduces the caesura, the cut that divides time into a before and after that cannot be joined. These syntheses are asymmetrical. They do not form a unity. They do not converge in a subject. They are heterogeneous operations that produce time as the condition of experience without presupposing a subject who experiences. This is the radicalization of Kant, keeping the transcendental method but removing the transcendental subject, thinking Genesis without a ground. The book's conclusion returns to the question of thought. If difference is primary, if identity is produced rather than given, then thought cannot be recognition. It must be an encounter with intensive differences, with problems that force the creation of new concepts, with what Deleuze calls ideas. Ideas are not mental representations. They are virtual structures, problem fields, multiplicities that actualize through differentiation. Thought engages ideas not by knowing them, but by encountering them, by being forced to think what cannot be thought through existing concepts. Difference and repetition is difficult because it argues on multiple levels simultaneously. There is the metaphysical level, rethinking the virtual and the actual, intensity and extension, difference and identity. There is the epistemological level, rethinking thought as encounter rather than recognition, learning rather than knowing. There is the ontological level, rethinking being as becoming, substance as process, identity as product. These levels interweave without reducing to a single argument. The book is also difficult because it is vertiginous. It asks you to think difference without thinking different things, to think repetition without thinking the same, to think intensity without reducing it to quality, to think the virtual without confusing it with the possible. These are not simple inversions of common sense. They are genuine attempts to think what common sense cannot think, to create concepts adequate to processes that exceed recognition. Deleuze never wrote another book at this level of systematic ambition. The collaboration with Guattari produced works that were more rhizomatic, less totalizing. The cinema books operated through typologies and examples rather than sustained argument. What is philosophy? Was reflective rather than constructive. Difference and repetition stands alone as the fullest exposition of Deleuze's metaphysics of difference. But it is not separate from the rest of his work. The concepts developed here, the virtual and the actual, intensity, differentiation, the three syntheses, ideas as problems, recur throughout the later books. They are transformed, applied to new domains, combined with concepts from Guattari, but they remain operative. Difference and repetition is the bedrock, the systematic foundation on which everything else builds. The question the book poses is simple but profound. What if difference is primary? What if identity, similarity, opposition, analogy, all the ways we usually think difference, are secondary effects? What if the world is not a collection of things that happen to differ, but a process of differentiation that produces things? What would it mean to think that? What concepts would we need? Deleuze spent the rest of his career answering. The distinction between the virtual and the actual runs through all of Deleuze's work. It is not a distinction between appearance and reality, or between mind and world, or between the abstract and the concrete. It is a distinction between two modes of the real, two ways that being can be. Both the virtual and the actual are real, but they are real in different ways. Start with what the virtual is not. It is not the possible. The possible is defined negatively as what is not yet real. A possible outcome is one that might happen but has not happened yet. When a possibility becomes real, it gains existence but nothing else changes. The possible and the real have the same form. They differ only in that one exists and the other does not. This model reduces creation to selection. The real is just the subset of the possible that happens to exist. Deleuze rejects this model because it makes the real resemble the possible that preceded it. If the possible already has the form of the real, then realization is not creation, but mere instantiation. Nothing genuinely new is produced. The possible king is structurally identical to the actual king, he just receives existence. But this cannot explain novelty, genuine becoming, the production of the unpredictable. The virtual is different. The virtual is fully real, but not actual. It does not lack existence. It has a different mode of existence, one that is not captured by the categories of actual things. The virtual exists as a structure of relations, a problem field, a set of potentials that condition but do not predetermine what actualizes from them. Bergson provides the clearest example: memory. Memory is not stored in the brain as traces that are retrieved when you remember. The brain is a material organ that operates in the present, selecting relevant memories for current action. But memory itself, the totality of your past, does not exist in the brain or anywhere in actual space. It exists virtually. The past coexists with the present, not as something that has ceased to be, but as a virtual dimension that is always already there. When you remember something, you do not retrieve a trace. You actualize a virtual memory. The memory exists virtually whether or not you happen to recall it. Forgetting is not the destruction of memory, but the failure to actualize it. This is why memories can return unexpectedly, triggered by sensations or associations that create the conditions for actualization. The past is not gone, it is virtual. This gives Deleuze a non-psychological theory of memory. Memory is not a faculty of the subject. It is an ontological dimension, a layer of the real that coexists with the actual present. Bergson called it pure memory, memory in itself, independent of any act of recollection. For Deleuze, this becomes a model of the virtual more generally. The virtual is what subsists independently of its actualization, what is real without being actual. Another example, the genetic code. The DNA in a fertilized egg does not contain a miniature organism waiting to grow. It contains information, a program, a set of instructions that will guide the differentiation of cells. This information is virtual. It is real. It exists. It has effects. It determines what kind of organism will develop. But it is not itself actual in the way the organism is actual. It exists as potential, as structure, as problem. When the embryo develops, the genetic code actualizes through differentiation. Cells divide and specialize. Tissues form. Organs emerge. The process is not the unfolding of something already present in miniature. It is the production of the actual through the differentiation of the virtual. The virtual code is not diminished by actualization. It remains in every cell, still virtual, still potential. But it has produced something actual, the organism. This is the key. Actualization is creation. It is not the realization of a pre-existing possibility. It is the production of the new through differentiation. The virtual actualizes by differentiating, by splitting into divergent lines, by producing differences that were not prefigured in the virtual structure. The genetic code can actualize into different organisms depending on environmental conditions, epigenetic factors, random variations. The virtual does not determine a single outcome. It conditions a field of possible actualizations, each of which will be genuinely new. Deleuze distinguishes differentiation from differentiation. Differentiation is the process by which the virtual diversifies internally, producing the structure that will actualize. Differentiation is the process by which the differentiated virtual produces actual differences, qualities, extensities, species. The two processes are inseparable. The virtual differentiates internally as it differentiates into the actual, but they are distinct moments of the same process. An organism differentiates internally at the genetic level, genes regulating genes, creating patterns of expression. It differentiates into actual parts, cells, tissues, organs, systems. The internal differentiation is virtual. The actual differentiation is what we observe as the development of the organism. But both are real. The virtual is as real as the actual, just real in a different mode. This has implications for how we understand problems and solutions. A problem is not a lack of knowledge that a solution fills. A problem is a virtual structure, a set of relations, a field of potentials. Solutions actualize the problem by differentiating it, by following out its implications in different directions. Multiple solutions can actualize the same problem. The problem does not resemble its solutions. It conditions them without determining them. Consider a mathematical problem. Find all functions that satisfy a given differential equation. The equation is the problem. It is virtual. It does not exist as a particular function, but as a structure of relations. The solutions are actual functions. There may be infinitely many solutions, each actualizing the problem differently. The problem is not erased by being solved. It remains as the virtual structure that generated the solutions. And the solutions do not resemble the problem. They are qualitatively different from the equation, even though they are produced by it. Deleuze applies this to ontology. Being is not a collection of actual things. Being is the process of actualization, the movement from the virtual to the actual. The actual things we encounter are always already actualizations of virtual structures. But the virtual is not prior in time. The virtual and the actual coexist. They are two sides of the real, two dimensions that cannot be separated but must be distinguished. This is why Deleuze is a dualist, not a dualist of mind and body or appearance and reality, but a dualist of the virtual and the actual. These are not two substances but two modes of being, two ways the real can be. Philosophy's task is to think both, to understand how the virtual actualizes and how the actual implies the virtual. The concept of the virtual allows Deleuze to think Genesis without teleology. Traditional accounts of development are either mechanical, the organism is preformed and just grows larger, or teleological, the organism develops toward a predetermined end. Deleuze rejects both. The virtual is not a blueprint that prefigures the actual. It is a field of potentials that actualizes through differentiation, producing novelty, divergence, unpredictability. But neither is the process random. It is conditioned by the structure of the virtual, even though that structure does not determine a unique outcome. This is transcendental empiricism. The transcendental is the virtual, the condition of actual experience that is not itself actual. The empirical is the actual, what is encountered, what is experienced. Traditional transcendental philosophy separates the two, making the transcendental a set of universal conditions that are independent of experience. Deleuze makes the transcendental immanent to experience, internal to the process of actualization, inseparable from the genesis of the actual. The virtual is not the same for all actual things. Each actual thing has its own virtual dimension, its own problem field, its own set of potentials. The virtual that actualizes as this organism is not the same as the virtual that actualizes as that organism. The virtual is singular, even though it is not individual. It is the singular structure of relations that conditions this particular actualization. Deleuze sometimes uses the language of events to describe the virtual. An event is not what happens, that is the actualization. An event is what insists in what happens, the virtual dimension that is expressed by the actual. The event is incorporeal, impersonal, pre-individual. It is what makes what happens significant, what gives it sense. The event of dying is not the physical death of an individual body. It is the virtual transformation, the caesura that divides life into before and after, that is expressed differently in each actual death. This brings the virtual close to what Deleuze means by sense. Sense is not meaning in the subjective sense, what something means to someone. Sense is the objective dimension of meaning, the event that is expressed in propositions, the incorporeal effect that results from bodily causes. Sense is virtual. It does not exist in the way actual things exist, but it is real, it has effects, it makes a difference. The virtual and the actual are asymmetrical. You cannot derive the actual from the virtual by a rule or algorithm. Actualization is creative, productive, unpredictable. But you also cannot derive the virtual from the actual by abstraction or generalization. The virtual is not the common essence extracted from actual instances. It is the genetic condition, the productive structure, the problem that generates solutions without resembling them. This makes the virtual difficult to grasp. You cannot represent it directly because representation gives you the actual, not the virtual. You cannot deduce it from principles because principles are already actual. You can only think it indirectly, through its effects, through the actualizations it produces, through the problems it poses. The virtual is real but elusive, present but invisible, effective but non-actual. Deleuze's commitment to the virtual marks a fundamental break with both empiricism and idealism. Empiricism reduces everything to actual experience, what is given to the senses, what is present to consciousness. Idealism reduces everything to the ideas or categories of the subject. Deleuze refuses both reductions. The real includes the virtual as a dimension that is neither subjective nor given to experience in the mode of actuality. The virtual is the transcendental field, but it is not transcendent. It is immanent to the actual even though it is distinct from it. The virtual is also the source of novelty, of genuine becoming, of the production of the new. If everything were actual, there could only be rearrangement, new combinations of existing elements. There could be no genuine creation. The virtual makes creation possible because it actualizes through differentiation, producing differences that were not pre-contained in the virtual structure. The new is not the realization of a possibility. It is the actualization of the virtual through a process that produces what did not exist before. This is why Deleuze insists that the virtual is not abstract. Abstraction moves from the particular to the general, from actual instances to universal concepts. The virtual is not general. It is singular, specific to each actualization. But it is not particular either, because it is not actual. It occupies a third position, singular but not individual, real but not actual, structural but not general. The concept of the virtual is essential for everything that follows in Deleuze's work. The body without organs is virtual. The plane of immanence is virtual. The event is virtual. The problem field is virtual. These are not metaphorical uses. They are all instances of the same fundamental distinction between the virtual as the condition of actualization and the actual as what is produced through differentiation. To think with Deleuze is to learn to think the virtual. This means abandoning the habit of reducing everything to the actual, to what is present, to what exists in space and time. It means recognizing a dimension of the real that is not given to experience but conditions experience, that is not represented but productive, that is not possible but fully real in its own mode. It means thinking Genesis, becoming creation as more than the reshuffling of the actual. It means thinking difference as productive of identity rather than derived from it. The virtual is Deleuze's answer to the question, how is the new possible? Not by the realization of pre-existing possibilities, not by random combinations of actual elements, but by the differentiation of the virtual, by the actualization of a real that is not yet actual, by the production of differences through a process that is conditioned but not determined. The virtual makes becoming thinkable. It makes creation ontologically primary rather than derivative. It makes difference precede identity. Logic of Sense appeared in 1969, the same year as Difference and Repetition. The two books were submitted together as Deleuze's doctoral thesis, the principal thesis and the complementary thesis in the French system. But they could not be more different in tone, style, and subject matter. Where Difference and Repetition is systematic and dense, Logic of Sense is playful and fragmentary. Where one argues through Kant and Hegel, the other works through Lewis Carroll and the Stoics. Where one builds a metaphysics of difference, the other explores the paradoxes of sense. The book is structured as a series of paradoxes, each organized around a problem or concept: the paradox of the pure event, the paradox of infinite regression, the paradox of sterile doubling. Each paradox involves Alice in Wonderland or Through the Looking Glass. Alice growing larger and smaller simultaneously, the Red Queen running to stay in place, Humpty Dumpty claiming words mean what he wants them to mean. These are not illustrations of pre-existing philosophical problems. They are philosophical problems in their own right, sites where sense breaks down or proliferates in unexpected ways. Sense is the central concept. What is sense? Not meaning in the psychological sense, what I intend by my words, not reference, the object my words denote. Sense is what a proposition expresses, what an event embodies, what lies between words and things. The Stoics called it the lekton, the seiable, the incorporeal effect of bodies. Deleuze retrieves this concept and makes it central to his philosophy of language and events. Consider the proposition: the tree is green. 3 dimensions can be distinguished. First, denotation. The proposition refers to an actual tree in the world. Second, manifestation. The proposition expresses the beliefs or desires of the speaker. Third, signification. The proposition has a logical structure, relates concepts, follows syntactic rules. These 3 dimensions, reference, expression, logical form, have dominated philosophy of language. But Deleuze argues there is a 4th dimension: sense. Sense is what the proposition expresses as distinct from what it denotes, manifests, or signifies. Sense is the event expressed by the proposition, the greening of the tree, the becoming green. This event is incorporeal. It is not a physical property of the tree, but the transformation, the transition, the event that happens on the surface of things. Sense is this surface effect, this event that is expressed in language but not reducible to language. The surface is crucial. Deleuze distinguishes between depth and surface. Depth is where bodies mix, where physical processes happen, where causes operate. Psychoanalysis goes into the depths, the unconscious, the drives, the body and its wounds. Deleuze wants to stay on the surface, not because the surface is superficial, but because the surface is where sense happens, where events are produced, where incorporeal effects become visible. Alice's adventures take place on surfaces. She falls through the looking glass into a world where the usual rules do not apply. She encounters entities that exist only on the surface. The Cheshire Cat's grin without the cat, the vanishing body and the persisting smile. These are incorporeal entities, surface effects that have reality without being actual bodies. They are pure events, sense without reference, expression without depth. The pure event is another key concept. An event is not what happens to a subject or an object. An event is what is expressed in what happens, the incorporeal transformation that results from the interactions of bodies. When the knife cuts the flesh, there is a bodily cause and a bodily effect, physical processes, material changes. But there is also the event of the cutting, the transformation from uncut to cut, the becoming cut of the flesh. This event is incorporeal. It does not exist in the flesh or in the knife. It subsists on the surface as the sense of what happens. Deleuze follows the Stoics in treating events as incorporeal. Bodies exist, act, and are acted upon. Events do not exist in the same way. They subsist or insist. They are expressed by propositions. They are the effects of bodily causes, but they are not themselves bodily. This gives them a paradoxical status, real but not actual, effective but incorporeal, objective but distinct from physical objects. The event has no present. This is one of the book's central paradoxes. An event divides time into past and future without ever occupying the present. When does the cutting happen? Not at any instant, because at any instant the cut is either not yet made or already made. The cutting happens in the transition, in the passage from past to future that never coincides with the present. The event is always already past and yet to come, never actually present. This makes the event infinitely divisible. You can always divide it further: the moment before the cutting, the moment after, the moment of contact, the moment of penetration. But you never reach a final indivisible moment when the event simply is. The event is pure becoming without being. It does not occupy time, it divides time. Deleuze connects this to aion and chronos, two aspects of time he draws from the Stoics. Chronos is the time of the present, the time of bodies mixing and acting, the time measured by clocks. Chronos is corporeal time, the time of causes and effects. Aion is the time of events, the time of sense, the time that is infinitely divisible into past and future without a present. Aion is incorporeal time, the time of what happens on the surface. These are not two separate times. They are two readings of time, two ways time can be articulated. Chronos subordinates past and future to the present, what was and what will be defined relative to what is now. Aion liberates past and future from the present. They stretch infinitely in both directions without grounding in any actual now. To think the event is to think in aion, in the time of pure becoming. Another series of paradoxes concerns language itself. Deleuze is fascinated by the way nonsense produces sense, by the way meaningless expressions can be meaningful. Lewis Carroll's portmanteau words, slithy, mimsy, outgrabe, mean nothing in the dictionary but produce effects of sense through their sound, their position in syntax, their evocation of multiple words at once. They are nonsense that makes sense, words without denotation that still express something. This leads to the concept of the empty square, or the aleatory point. In every structure there is an element that belongs to the structure, but has no fixed position, that circulates through all positions without occupying any. This paradoxical element is what makes the structure function, what produces sense by evading determination. In language, words like this or it or thing serve this function. They have no fixed reference but allow reference to happen. In thought, problems serve this function. They have no fixed solution but generate solutions by remaining open. The empty square is also the place of the subject, but not the subject as a fixed identity or a transcendental ground. The subject is the empty place that thought passes through, the void around which sense organizes, the fracture that makes sense possible. Deleuze follows Lacan here. The subject is not a substance but a cut, a lack, an empty square in the symbolic structure. Logic of Sense is a darker book than its playful surface suggests. It is preoccupied with wounds, with schizophrenia, with the collapse of sense into nonsense. Deleuze discusses Antonin Artaud, the poet and playwright whose language broke down into glossolalia, whose body became a site of unbearable suffering, whose thought pushed to the edge where sense becomes scream. Arta represents the danger of depths, of descending below the surface where sense operates into the chaos of bodies without organization. The body without organs appears here for the first time, drawn from Artaud. The body without organs is not an organism. It is a body that has undone its organization, that refuses the distribution of organs into functions, that becomes a surface of intensities without structure. Artaud describes it as the body that resists the organized body imposed by medicine, society, family. But it is also the body that risks total collapse, the schizophrenic body that cannot maintain the surface where sense happens. Deleuze is ambivalent about the body without organs in this text. It represents a limit, a danger, but also a possibility. The body without organs is what remains when organization is suspended. Pure intensity, pure effect, pure capacity to be affected. But pushed too far, it becomes catatonia, the frozen body that can no longer respond. The task is to undo organization without destroying the body, to maintain the surface while opening it to new intensities. The concept of the crack runs through the book. The crack is the event that splits a life into before and after, the wound that cannot heal, the caesura that divides time. Scott Fitzgerald spoke of the crack-up, the moment when everything that held your life together breaks. Deleuze reads this as an event in the technical sense, an incorporeal transformation, a shift in sense, a redistribution of the possible. The crack is not something that happens once. It persists. It insists. It determines how everything after is experienced. The crack is also the place where depth and surface meet, where the bodily wound produces the incorporeal event. Physical suffering produces the event of suffering, which is not reducible to the physical pain. Betrayal by a friend produces the event of betrayal, which is not exhausted by the actions that constituted it. These events mark the subject, create a before and after, establish a new distribution of sense. Deleuze's engagement with psychoanalysis is critical but not dismissive. Freud and Lacan discovered something essential, the unconscious structured like a language, the symbolic order, the role of the signifier. But they go too deep. They interpret everything in terms of the Oedipal drama, the castration complex, the name of the father. They reduce sense to these familial structures. Deleuze wants to stay on the surface, where sense proliferates beyond any single structure, where events happen that cannot be reduced to family triangles. The book's method is strange. Each series begins with a paradox, often from Carroll, sometimes from the Stoics or from modern logic. The paradox is not solved, but unfolded, developed, connected to other paradoxes. Concepts emerge: sense, event, surface, ion, the empty square, but they are not defined in advance. They are produced through the movement of the text, through the engagement with problems. The book enacts its own theory of sense. Sense is not given, but produced, not found, but created through engagement with paradoxes. Logic of sense is often read as Deleuze's philosophy of language, but it is also his philosophy of events, his philosophy of time, his philosophy of the incorporeal. It is the complement to difference and repetition. Where that book works through the virtual and the actual, this book works through sense and event. Where that book is concerned with ontology, this book is concerned with what happens on the surface of being, with the effects and expressions that do not have the same status as being, but are no less real. The book's final series concerns the static genesis. How does sense emerge? Not from a pre-existing subject who confers meaning, not from a pre-existing language that already contains all possible senses. Sense is produced through a genesis that is static rather than dynamic. A genesis that does not unfold in time, but establishes the conditions for time itself. The genesis of sense is the production of the surface. the separation of depths and heights, the establishment of aion as the time of events. This genesis is not something that happened once and is now complete. It is happening always, at every moment when sense is produced, when an event is expressed, when language functions. The static genesis is the transcendental operation that makes experience possible, but it is not separate from experience. It is immanent, internal, productive. Logic of Sense is a difficult book, but its difficulty is different from that of difference and repetition. It is not the difficulty of dense argument or technical precision. It is the difficulty of following the surface, of resisting the pull to depths or heights, of thinking sense as distinct from both signification and denotation. It requires learning to see events where you normally see only causes and effects, to see the incorporeal where you normally see only bodies, to see sense where you normally see only meanings or references. The book has been influential in literary theory, in film studies, in cultural criticism. The concept of the event, the attention to surface, the critique of depth models, these have been taken up across disciplines. But the book is also essential for understanding Deleuze's overall project. It shows that his commitment to immanence does not mean reducing everything to material bodies. There are incorporeal realities, events, sense, pure becoming, that are fully real without being actual, that operate on surfaces without being superficial. The two books submitted as Deleuze's thesis, Difference and Repetition and Logic of Sense, work together. One gives the ontology of the virtual and the actual. The other gives the logic of sense and event. One is systematic, the other fragmentary. One serious, the other playful. But they share the same commitment to think difference, to think becoming, to think what exceeds recognition and representation. Together they establish the concepts Deleuze will develop, transform, and apply in everything that follows. The collaboration was unlikely. Deleuze worked alone, slowly, through patient reading and writing. He produced dense systematic works that engaged the history of philosophy at the highest level of technical precision. He avoided political militancy, was suspicious of group movements, preferred the solitude of study to the intensity of collective action. His work up to this point, on Hume, Bergson, Nietzsche, Spinoza, the major books of 1968 and 1969, belong to philosophy in a recognizable sense. Guattari came from a different world. He had trained as a pharmacist but turned to psychoanalysis, working at Laborde, an experimental psychiatric clinic in the Loire Valley directed by Jean Houry. Laborde rejected the authoritarian structure of traditional mental hospitals, organized patients and staff as a collective, treated psychosis not as illness to be cured, but as process to be navigated. Guattari was immersed in this clinical work, running therapeutic sessions, organizing institutional structures, engaging with patients whose grip on reality was tenuous or shattered. He was also politically engaged. He had been active in Trotskyist groups, participated in protests and strikes written for leftist journals. May 1968 found him on the streets, not in the library. He was interested in how social structures produce subjectivity, how capitalism shapes desire, how institutional forms constrain or enable new modes of living. His thinking was not systematic but associative, diagrammatic, connective, finding resonances between heterogeneous domains rather than building unified theories. Deleuze and Guattari connected around a shared problem, desire. Psychoanalysis, particularly in its Lacanian form dominant in France, treated desire as fundamentally negative. Desire arises from lack. The child desires the mother because it lacks her. The subject desires the object because it does not have it. Desire is defined by what it does not have, structured by absence, organized around an impossible object. Psychoanalysis interprets all desire through the Oedipal structure: father, mother, child, the triangle that supposedly determines all subsequent relations. Deleuze and Guattari rejected this framework. Desire is not lack. Desire is production. It does not lack its object. It produces its object in the process of desiring. Desire is not organized around the family triangle. It connects heterogeneous elements, forms assemblages, produces realities. The Oedipal framework reduces all desire to the same structure, makes everything a variation on the same drama. But desire is multiple, productive, machinic. The concept of the machine became central, not machines in the technical sense, although industrial machines are relevant, but desiring machines, arrangements that produce connections, that couple heterogeneous elements that function without purpose or plan. The mouth is a machine that connects to the breast to the milk to the digestive system. Each connection is productive, generates flows, produces something new. There is no subject who desires. There are machines that produce desire as their operation. This was Guattari's language more than Deleuze's. Guattari thought in terms of machines, diagrams, assemblages, connections. He drew schematics, made charts, mapped relations between domains. His writing style was more aleatory, more willing to juxtapose without synthesizing. Deleuze brought philosophical precision to these intuitions, connected them to concepts from Spinoza and Nietzsche and Bergson, gave them systematic development without losing their wildness. Their collaboration was genuinely reciprocal. They wrote together, not Deleuze writing first drafts and Guattari revising, but actually writing together, passing pages back and forth, building texts through dialogue and interaction. They described it as producing a third voice, something that belonged to neither alone. The books they wrote together are recognizably different from Deleuze's solo works. More experimental, more politically charged, more willing to provoke and offend. The political context mattered. May 1968 had opened space for radical questioning of institutions, power, subjectivity. The traditional left, the Communist Party, orthodox Marxism, seemed inadequate to the new forms of struggle emerging around the university, mental health, sexuality, everyday life. The question was not just how to seize state power, but how to transform the microphysics of power, the production of subjectivity, the organization of desire. Foucault was exploring similar terrain. His books on madness, the clinic, punishment, showed how power operates not just through repression, but through production, producing the normal subject, the docile body, the categories through which we understand ourselves. Deleuze and Guattari extended this insight to desire itself. Capitalism does not just repress desire, it produces desire, shapes it, channels it into certain forms. The question is not how to liberate repressed desire, but how to escape the production of desire that serves capital. Their first book together, Anti-Oedipus, emerged from these concerns. It was written quickly by philosophical standards. Between 1969 and 1972, it was massive, sprawling, uncontainable. It attacked psychoanalysis for reducing desire to family structures, attacked capitalism for its capture and recoding of flows, attacked the state for its apparatus of capture. It proposed schizoanalysis as an alternative, not curing schizophrenia, but learning from the schizophrenic process, from the deterritorialization of codes, from the flight from organized identity. The book was an event. Foucault called it an introduction to the non-fascist life. It became a reference point for post-68 radicalism, for anti-psychiatry, for critiques of normalization. It was also deeply controversial, accused of romanticizing mental illness, of political naivete, of obscurantism. The book did not seek consensus. It was deliberately excessive, provocative, unsettling. Guattari brought clinical experience that grounded the abstractions. He worked with psychotic patients, people whose relation to language and identity had shattered. He saw how their symptoms could not be reduced to familial neuroses, how their productions, the signs, the connections, the strange utterances, had their own logic. Psychosis was not simply a deficit, a failure of normal functioning. It was a different mode of production, one that escaped the organized structures of neurosis. Deleuze brought the philosophical concepts, the body without organs from Artaud, the plane of immanence from Spinoza, intensity from difference and repetition, the virtual and the actual. These concepts were transformed in the collaboration. The body without organs became a practice, a way of undoing organization without destroying the capacity to function. The plane of immanence became the field on which desiring machines operate. Intensity became the flows of desire that the machines produce and interrupt. Their working method was unusual. They talked for hours, building concepts through conversation. Guattari would bring clinical material, political analyses, diagrams. Deleuze would develop these philosophically, connect them to his readings of Kant and Bergson and Nietzsche, give them conceptual precision. The writing was collaborative, but not uniform. Some sections more Guattarian, more wild and associative, others more Deleuzian, more systematic and philosophical. The collaboration lasted over 20 years, producing Anti-Oedipus in 1972, Kafka, Toward a Minor Literature in 1975, 1,000 Plateaus in 1980, and What is Philosophy in 1991. Between these co-authored works, each continued to write independently. Deleuze produced the cinema books, the book on Leibniz, the book on Foucault. Guattari wrote on ecosophy, on semiotics, on institutional analysis. But the collaborative works defined a distinct project, different from what either could have produced alone. The friendship was profound. They spent long periods working together, talking, thinking through problems. But they also respected each other's independence, their different styles and concerns. Deleuze was the philosopher, the rigorous conceptual architect. Guattari was the militant, the clinician, the experimenter. Together they formed a machine, not a harmonious unity, but a productive coupling that generated something new. Guattari died in 1992, a year after What is Philosophy appeared. Deleuze wrote the preface to a collection of Guattari's essays, noting the loss of his collaborator, his friend, his intercessor. The collaborative work ended, but its effects persisted. The concepts they created together, deterritorialization, assemblage, rhizome, body without organs, lines of flight, entered the vocabulary of critical theory, political thought, cultural studies. They continued to work in contexts Deleuze and Guattari never anticipated. The meeting in 1969 changed both their trajectories. Deleuze's work became more experimental, more politically engaged, more willing to connect philosophy to psychoanalysis, politics, literature, art. Guattari's work gained philosophical rigor and precision. Together they invented a new way of thinking, not dialectical, not phenomenological, not structuralist, but rhizomatic, machinic, multiple. They called it schizoanalysis. They called it pragmatics. They called it the construction of concepts on a plane of immanence. Whatever the name, it was something genuinely new, a mode of thought adequate to the complexity and multiplicity of contemporary life. The encounter with Guattari made Deleuze's thought move differently. The solo works had been systematic, careful, grounded in close readings of canonical philosophers. The collaborative works were wilder, more willing to mix registers, more explicitly political. The shift was not a break. The concepts from difference and repetition reappear in Anti-Oedipus, transformed but recognizable. But the tone changed, the ambition expanded, the scope widened. Deleuze became a different kind of thinker through the collaboration. This is what Deleuze valued in encounters. They forced thought to move differently, to create concepts it could not have created alone. Guattari was such an encounter, not an influence to be absorbed, but a force that made Deleuze think in new ways, produce new concepts, write in a new voice. The monstrous offspring of their collaboration belongs to both and to neither. It stands as one of the most radical philosophical experiments of the late 20th century. Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia appeared in 1972, 3 years after Deleuze and Guattari began working together. The title announces its target: Oedipus, the familial structure that psychoanalysis places at the center of desire. But the book's ambitions extend far beyond a critique of Freud. It is simultaneously a theory of desire, an analysis of capitalism, a critique of the state, an alternative to both liberal and Marxist political economy, and a proposal for a new practice called schizoanalysis. The book begins with a provocation. It is at work everywhere, functioning smoothly at times, at other times in fits and starts. It breathes, it heats, it eats, it shits and fucks. What a mistake to have ever said the ID. Everywhere it is machines, real ones, not figurative, machines driving other machines, machines being driven by other machines, with all the necessary couplings and connections. This opening refuses the psychoanalytic framework before the argument even begins. There is no id, no unified psychic structure, no subject that desires. There are only desiring machines, arrangements that produce flows, connections, assemblages. The mouth machine connects to the breast machine. The anus machine connects to the feces machine. These are not metaphors. They are actual productions, actual couplings, actual functions. Desire is production, not production of representations or fantasies. Actual production, material production, the production of reality. Desire does not lack its object, the notion that became central to Lacanian psychoanalysis. Desire produces its object in the process of desiring. The breast is not something the infant lacks and therefore desires. The breast is produced as an object through the coupling of the mouth and the breast, through the flow of milk, through the machinic connection that produces satisfaction. This is a radical claim. It rejects the entire psychoanalytic edification of desire as lack, as structured by absence, as oriented toward an impossible object. Freud based his theory on the idea that the child desires the mother but cannot have her, that this originary lack structures all subsequent desire. Lacan formalized this with the concept of the objet petit a, the lost object that can never be recovered, that desire circles around endlessly without attaining. Deleuze and Guattari reject the framework entirely. Desire is not organized around absence. It is productive connection, actual assembly, machinic coupling. The Oedipal structure is not a universal of human psychology. It is a product produced by certain social arrangements, particularly the bourgeois family. Psychoanalysis takes this product, this specific historical formation, and treats it as the structure of the unconscious itself. It says, all desire is Oedipal, all conflicts are father-mother-child triangles, all symptoms are variations on castration anxiety and penis envy. This reduction serves a function. It privatizes desire, makes it a matter of family dynamics, cuts it off from social and political investments. But desire is social before it is familial. The child's desire is immediately caught up in social investments, in the organization of production, in flows of money and commodities, in the distribution of power and resources. Oedipus is imposed afterward as a restriction, a coding, a way of saying, your desire is not really social, it is about mommy and daddy. Psychoanalysis participates in this coding. It offers to cure the Oedipal neurosis while reinforcing the framework that produces neurosis in the first place. Deleuze and Guattari propose schizoanalysis as an alternative. Not a new therapy, they are not proposing a cure, but a different way of understanding desire. Schizoanalysis does not interpret desire according to pre-existing structures. It asks, what does desire produce? What connections does it make? What flows does it generate? Where does it get blocked or captured? It is a pragmatics of desire rather than a hermeneutics of meaning. The term schizophrenia requires clarification. Deleuze and Guattari are not romanticizing mental illness. They are not saying schizophrenia as a clinical condition is desirable or healthy. They distinguish the schizophrenic process from the schizophrenic entity. The process is the movement of deterritorialization, the flight from organized structures, the tendency of decoded flows to escape recapture. The entity is what happens when this process becomes trapped, frozen, when the person cannot function within any social organization. Clinical schizophrenia is not liberation. It is a specific form of suffering that requires care and attention. But the schizophrenic process reveals something about capitalism. Capitalism is a system that decodes flows, breaks up traditional social structures, releases labor from feudal ties, converts everything into exchangeable commodities, abstracts from particular contents to pure quantitative exchange. Marx saw this. Capitalism dissolves all fixed relations, all stable identities. Everything solid melts into air. The schizophrenic process is this tendency pushed to its limit, where decoded flows escape entirely from the structures that would recapture them. But capitalism does not simply decode. It also recodes, reterritorializes. It breaks up the peasant commune and codes workers as wage laborers. It dissolves traditional authority and codes individuals as legal subjects. It deterritorializes desires from local contexts and reterritorializes them on the body of capital itself. The question, can flows be deterritorialized without being immediately recaptured, recoded, reterritorialized? This brings in the concept of the body without organs. The body without organs is not a body that lacks organs. It is a body that has undone its organization, that refuses the distribution of organs into functional hierarchies. The organism is organized, mouth for eating, genitals for reproduction, anus for excretion, each organ assigned a function within a structured totality. The body without organs resists this organization. It becomes a surface of intensities, of flows, of connections that are not determined by functional purpose. Antonin Artaud created the concept in his writings on the theatre and his attacks on the judgments of God that organized bodies into functional systems. Deleuze and Guattari adapt it as a way of thinking about how desire operates. Desire does not respect the organization of the organism. It makes connections that are transversal, perverse, non-functional. The body without organs is the limit of this movement, a body that would be pure intensity, pure capacity to be affected without any preset organization. But there is danger here. If you destroy organization entirely, you get the catatonic body, the frozen body, the body without any capacity for connection. The body without organs is not a goal to be reached by destroying the organs. It is a practice, a process of experimentation. The question is always, how far can you go in undoing organization without losing the capacity to connect, to produce, to function. This is why Deleuze and Guattari say you need a dose of caution. The body without organs is not something you achieve once and for all. It is something you construct carefully, experimentally, piece by piece. The book's analysis of capitalism is detailed and complex. Deleuze and Guattari draw on Marx but transform his categories. Capitalism is defined by three characteristics. First, it decodes flows, breaks up traditional codings, releases flows from fixed structures. Second, it substitutes abstract quantities for qualitative codes. Everything becomes exchangeable through money. Third, it conjugates decoded flows on the body of capital, wage labour and capital, consumption and production, all brought into relation through market mechanisms. This gives capitalism a unique relationship to desire. Pre-capitalist societies code desire strictly through kinship structures, religious prohibitions, sumptuary laws, caste systems. Desire is bound to specific objects, specific practices, specific identities. Capitalism breaks these codes. It tells you, desire anything as long as you can pay for it. This appears as liberation, but it is also a new form of capture. Desires are deterritorialized from traditional contexts and re-territorialized on commodities, on consumption, on the endless circulation of capital. The state plays a crucial role. The state is not simply the executive committee of the ruling class, as vulgar Marxism would have it. The state is an apparatus of capture. It captures flows, codes them, organizes them into hierarchies. The state form predates capitalism. It emerged in ancient despotisms, continued through feudalism. Capitalism uses the state, but also tends to undermine it, to decode flows in ways that escape state control. The tension between capitalism's deterritorializing tendency and the state's re-territorializing function is central to how modern societies operate. Deleuze and Guattari distinguish three types of social machines. The primitive territorial machine codes flows through kinship, through prohibitions, through rituals that inscribe debt on bodies. The despotic machine overcodes these flows, bringing them under a transcendent unity, the despot, the god, the law. The capitalist machine decodes and deterritorializes, releasing flows from traditional codes, but then axiomatizes them, brings them under abstract quantitative regulation. Each machine has its own mode of capturing desire, its own way of coding social production. The book's tone is deliberately excessive. It piles up examples, shifts between registers, moves from psychoanalytic case studies to economic analysis to literary texts without warning. It is difficult to summarize because it resists the kind of systematic development that would make summary possible. The point is not to build a theory that can be extracted and applied, but to produce an effect, to make the reader think differently about desire, capitalism, the relation between the psychological and the social. One of the book's most provocative claims, there is only desire and the social, nothing else. This means there is no individual psychology that can be studied apart from social investments. The unconscious is not a theatre where family dramas play out. The unconscious is a factory, a site of production, where desiring machines connect with social machines. Your desires are immediately social, invested in forms of production, in distributions of power, in economic structures. To treat them as merely personal or familial is to miss their real determination. This has implications for politics. Revolutionary politics is not about consciousness raising, not about making people aware of their real interests. It is about liberating desire from its capture by capitalist and state machines. But this liberation is not spontaneous. Desire can invest fascism as easily as communism. Desire can be reactive, seeking security and identity rather than creation and flight. The question is, what are the conditions under which desire invests in its own repression? Reich's question, why do people desire their own oppression? Why do they vote for fascists, support authoritarian leaders, embrace systems that exploit them? The answer cannot be false consciousness. People are not simply mistaken about their interests. They desire a certain organization of social life, even when that organization oppresses them. Desire is not naturally revolutionary. It must be made revolutionary through practices that undo its coding, that open lines of flight, that create new possibilities for connection and production. Schizoanalysis proposes such practices. It asks, what are your lines of flight? Where do your flows tend? What blocks them? What captures them? It does not interpret according to Oedipus. It does not reduce everything to family structures. It maps desire in its social investments, its material connections, its productive assemblages. This is not therapy in the clinical sense. It is analysis in the sense of taking apart, of decomposing structures to see how they function, of finding the points where new compositions become possible. The book ends with a vision. Not a utopia. Deleuze and Guattari are too suspicious of utopian thinking, but a direction, an orientation, toward the deterritorialization of flows, toward assemblages that are not captured by capital or state, toward becomings that escape identity, toward a schizophrenic pole where desire produces without coding, without organization, without the structures that confine it to reproduction of the same. This is not a goal to be achieved, but a tendency to be followed, a line of flight to be pursued. Anti-Oedipus was a scandal. It attacked institutions, psychoanalysis, the family, the state. It used language that offended. Schizophrenia, shit, fuck, deterritorialization. It refused academic propriety, mixed Marx with Freud, with Nietzsche, with anthropology, with political economy, without respecting disciplinary boundaries. It was embraced by radicals and condemned by traditionalists. It could not be ignored. The book's influence extended far beyond philosophy. It shaped anti-psychiatry, feminist theory, queer theory, cultural studies, political activism. The concepts entered common usage, often detached from their original context. People spoke of deterritorialization without knowing Deleuze and Guattari, used body without organs as a slogan, invoked lines of flight. This was inevitable. The book was designed to be taken up, used, applied, even if that meant being misunderstood or simplified. For Deleuze and Guattari, Anti-Oedipus was the first volume of a project they called Capitalism and Schizophrenia. The second volume, 1,000 Plateaus, would appear 8 years later. Between them, the terms shifted. Machines became assemblages. Flows became lines. The body without organs was further developed, but the basic orientation remained. Desire is production, not lack. Capitalism deterritorializes and reterritorializes. Schizoanalysis maps investments, traces connections, finds lines of flight. The project continued. Anti-Oedipus announced its project in the subtitle, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. The pairing is provocative. What does capitalism have to do with schizophrenia? The connection is not causal. Capitalism does not cause schizophrenia as a mental illness. The connection is structural. Capitalism operates through a logic of decoding and deterritorialization that reaches its limit in the schizophrenic process. Understanding capitalism requires understanding this process, understanding what happens when flows escape coding entirely. Capitalism is unique among social formations. Pre-capitalist societies coded flows through various mechanisms, kinship structures, religious prohibitions, sumptuary laws, caste systems. Each society had ways of determining who could exchange with whom, what could be exchanged, under what conditions. These codes constrained economic activity, kept it subordinated to non-economic ends: honor, salvation, cosmic order. Production served social reproduction. Exchange was embedded in social relations. Capitalism decodes these flows. It breaks up traditional structures, releases labor from feudal ties, converts land into a commodity, makes money the universal equivalent. Everything can be exchanged with everything else, mediated through the abstract medium of money. Particular qualities, this kind of labor, that kind of good, become commensurate through price. The market does not care about honor or tradition or sacred prohibitions. It cares only about profitability, about the expanded reproduction of capital. Marx saw this destructive aspect of capitalism. The Communist Manifesto describes how capitalism dissolves all fixed relations, tears apart traditional bonds, reduces everything to cash payment. Deleuze and Guattari follow Marx here. Capitalism is the first social formation that operates by decoding rather than coding. Where previous societies constrained flows, capitalism releases them. Where previous societies maintained qualitative distinctions, capitalism abstracts to pure quantity. But capitalism does not simply release flows and leave them free. It recodes them, reterritorializes them, brings them under new forms of regulation. The decoded flow of labor meets the decoded flow of capital in the wage relation. This coupling is new, specific to capitalism. The worker is free, not bound to land or lord, but this freedom is also separation, dispossession. The worker must sell labor power to live. Capital must buy labor power to valorize itself. The two flows are brought into relation through the market, through contract, through the legal forms of the capitalist state. This process of decoding and recoding happens across multiple domains. Traditional communities are broken up, and individuals are recoded as legal subjects with rights and obligations. Extended families are dissolved, and nuclear families become the units of consumption. Regional cultures are deterritorialized, and popular culture is reterritorialized through mass media. In each case, the movement is double. Something is broken up, released, deterritorialized, and then captured, reorganized, reterritorialized in a new form compatible with capital accumulation. The schizophrenic process is this tendency pushed to its limit. Schizophrenia as a clinical condition involves the breakdown of coding. Language fragments, identities dissolve, connections proliferate without organization. The schizophrenic patient experiences decoded flows directly, without the mediating structures that would organize them into coherent experience. This is not desirable. It is often terrifying, disabling, a form of profound suffering. But it reveals something about capitalism's tendency, the push toward absolute decoding, toward flows that escape all structure. Capitalism fears this limit. It decodes flows to increase mobility, flexibility, innovation. But it must also prevent flows from escaping entirely. If labor becomes too mobile, workers might refuse work altogether. If desire becomes too fluid, consumption patterns might become unpredictable. If money flows too freely across borders, states lose control over their economies. Capitalism requires both the deterritorializing tendency to break up rigidities, to release flows, and the reterritorializing apparatus to capture flows, to channel them back into productive circuits. This is why capitalism is defined by its relationship to its own limit. The limit is not external, it is not another mode of production that would replace capitalism. The limit is internal. It is the schizophrenic tendency within capitalism itself, the tendency of decoded flows to escape recapture. Capitalism continually pushes toward this limit and continually pulls back from it. It deterritorializes and reterritorializes in the same movement. The state plays a crucial role in this process. Deleuze and Guattari reject the idea that the state is simply an instrument of the ruling class. The state is an apparatus of capture with its own logic, its own imperatives. The state form predates capitalism. It emerged in ancient despotisms where power was concentrated in a transcendent authority. The despot was the principle of unity, the point from which all codes emanated. The despotic state overcoded tribal societies, brought diverse groups under a single law, a single god, a single authority. Capitalism both uses and undermines the state. It uses the state to enforce contracts, maintain infrastructure, manage crises. But capitalism also tends to escape state control, to decode flows in ways that transgress national boundaries, that evade regulation. The tension between the deterritorializing tendency of capital and the reterritorializing function of the state is constitutive of modern politics. Deleuze and Guattari distinguish two poles within any social formation. The paranoid pole organizes around transcendent unity, one God, one law, one leader. It codes flows through hierarchical structures, through identifications with authority, through the establishment of fixed identities. Fascism operates at this pole. It offers identity, belonging, the comforts of hierarchy and submission. The schizophrenic pole moves toward absolute decoding, toward flows that escape all structure, toward multiplicities that cannot be organized into unities. Revolutionary movements can operate at this pole. They break up existing structures, open lines of flight, create new possibilities. But neither pole is good or bad in itself. The paranoid pole offers stability, identity, the possibility of coordinated action. The schizophrenic pole offers flight, experimentation, the production of the new. Political struggle involves navigating between these poles, preventing capture without falling into complete disorganization. This is the question that runs through the book. How to deterritorialize without becoming a black hole, without losing the capacity for connection and production? The analysis of capitalism in Anti-Oedipus draws on but transforms Marxist categories. Deleuze and Guattari accept Marx's analysis of surplus value, of exploitation, of the tendency toward crisis. But they reject the base superstructure model that treats culture and ideology as mere reflections of economic relations. Desire is primary. Economic relations are themselves investments of desire. People desire capitalism, desire the organization of production around profit, desire the structures that exploit them. This is not false consciousness. It is a real investment of desire that must be explained, not explained away. This leads to a theory of social investment. There are two kinds of social investment, preconscious and unconscious. Preconscious investment is how desire invests in specific interest groups, identities, class positions. I invest in being a worker or a capitalist or a middle-class consumer. These investments are strategic, partial, shifting. Unconscious investment is how desire invests in the social field as a whole, in the form of social production itself. Do I desire a society organized around commodification and exchange? Do I desire hierarchical structures? Do I desire the security of identity or the mobility of becoming? Fascism works by manipulating unconscious investment. It does not appeal to class interest. It cuts across classes. It appeals to desire for identity, for belonging, for submission to authority. It offers the comfort of paranoia, the clear identification of enemies, the fantasy of unity, the promise of order. Fascism is not an error or a regression. It is a real investment of desire that must be combated on the terrain of desire itself, not simply through rational argument or economic analysis. Revolutionary politics, then, must address desire. It must show that desire can invest differently, can create assemblages that are not organized around identity and hierarchy, can find lines of flight that escape both capitalist capture and fascist paranoia. This is not a matter of consciousness raising. It is a matter of experimentation, of creating practices that reorganize desire, that make new investments possible. The question of ends and means becomes complicated. Deleuze and Guattari reject teleological thinking. There is no final revolution, no end of history, no ultimate liberation. There are only processes, tendencies, lines of flight. Some movements deterritorialize, opening new possibilities. Others reterritorialize, re-establishing order and hierarchy. Politics is the struggle between these tendencies, not the pursuit of a predetermined goal. This makes their politics difficult to classify. They are not anarchists. They do not believe in the spontaneous goodness of released desire. They are not orthodox Marxists. They reject the primacy of class struggle and the inevitability of proletarian revolution. They are not liberals. They have no faith in rights, representation, or reform. They propose something else, a politics of experimentation, of assemblages, of becomings, of lines of flight. A micropolitics that operates at the level of desire, that creates new forms of life rather than seizing state power. The book's reception was intensely polarized. Radicals embraced it as a manifesto for post-68 politics, a way of thinking beyond both Stalinism and social democracy. Psychoanalysts attacked it for misunderstanding Freud, for romanticizing psychosis, for political naivete. Marxists criticized it for abandoning class analysis, for fetishizing desire, for theoretical obscurantism. Liberals dismissed it as incoherent radicalism. The book refused to fit existing categories, refused to speak the language of any established discourse. Foucault's preface to the English translation called it an introduction to the non-fascist life. This was provocative but accurate. The book asks, how do you prevent fascism, not just as a political regime, but as a tendency within all of us, the tendency towards submission, toward identity, toward the comforts of paranoia? The answer is not moral exhortation. It is practical experimentation. Finding ways to live that do not invest in authority, that do not desire oppression, that open lines of flight while maintaining the capacity for connection. Anti-Oedipus was the first volume of Capitalism and Schizophrenia. It established the terms desire as production, the Oedipal as coding, schizoanalysis as alternative. But it was still organized, still somewhat systematic, still arguable within philosophical terms. The second volume, 1,000 Plateaus, would push further. It would abandon the book form entirely, become rhizomatic, operate by connection rather than argument. The project would radicalize itself. 1,000 Plateaus appeared in 1980, 8 years after Anti-Oedipus. It is the second volume of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, but it is not a sequel. It does not continue where the first volume left off. It does not develop arguments already established. It does something different entirely. It refuses the book form, refuses linear development, refuses the unity of a single subject matter. It is a rhizome. The introduction, titled Rhizome, establishes a new model of thought. A rhizome is a botanical structure, horizontal stems that spread underground, sending up shoots at various points. Grass is rhizomatic, so are certain ferns, bamboo, ginger. A rhizome has no center, no hierarchy, no beginning or end. Any point can connect to any other point. It can be broken and start again elsewhere. It grows in multiple directions simultaneously without coordination or plan. Contrast this with the tree. The tree has a central trunk, roots that go deep, branches that spread upward in organized patterns. The tree is a figure for hierarchical thought, a single origin, linear development, vertical organization. Philosophy has operated according to the tree model. Concepts branch from principles. Systems develop from foundations. Arguments proceed from premises to conclusions. There is a root, a structure, a unity. Deleuze and Guattari reject this model. They propose thinking rhizomatically, making connections between heterogeneous elements, following lines that lead in unexpected directions, refusing to subordinate multiplicity to unity. A rhizome connects any point to any other without passing through a center. It operates by variation, expansion, conquest, capture, but not by reproduction or representation. It is always in the middle, never at the beginning or the end. This is not just a metaphor for how to think, it is a claim about how things actually are. Thought is rhizomatic, language is rhizomatic, social formations are rhizomatic. Biology is increasingly recognized as rhizomatic. Horizontal gene transfer, symbiosis, networks of interaction that cannot be reduced to tree-structured phylogenies. The tree has been the Western image of thought. The rhizome is the alternative Deleuze and Guattari propose. The book consists of 15 plateaus. A plateau is a continuous region of intensity, a zone where something happens without tending toward a climax or resolution. It is borrowed from Bateson's concept of a plateau in sexual experience, a sustained level of intensity rather than a drive toward orgasm. Each plateau in the book is autonomous. You can enter anywhere, read them in any order, make connections as you see fit. There is no prescribed sequence, no necessary development from one to the next. The plateaus cover wildly different topics. One is about linguistics and pragmatics. One is about music and territory. One is about the state and the war machine. One is about becoming animal. One is about the face and faciality. One is about the body without organs. One is about the smooth and the striated. Each develops concepts, builds assemblages, makes connections. But they are not chapters in an argument. They are intensities, regions to be explored, fields to be traversed. The concept of the assemblage becomes central. An assemblage is an arrangement of heterogeneous elements that functions as a unit without forming a totality. It is not a structure. Structures have fixed positions and determined relations. An assemblage brings together bodies, actions, statements, technologies, desires that have no essential unity but produce effects through their arrangement. An assemblage can be taken apart. Its elements can enter into different assemblages, but while it operates, it has consistency. Deleuze and Guattari give the example of a feudal assemblage. It includes bodies: the knight's body, the horse's body, the peasant's body. It includes technologies: armour, stirrups, weapons, agricultural tools. It includes statements, oaths of fealty, commands, prayers. It includes effects: courage, fear, loyalty. These elements come from different domains, have different natures, but they compose an assemblage that functions. The feudal system is not a structure that determines how each element behaves. It is an assemblage that holds together as long as its components continue to function together. Every assemblage has two axes. One axis concerns content and expression. Content is machinic: bodies, actions, material processes. Expression is collective enunciation: statements, signs, regimes of signs. These are not base and superstructure. They are two aspects of the same assemblage, heterogeneous but inseparable. The other axis concerns territorialization and deterritorialization. Every assemblage is territorialized. It has a territory, a place where it operates, a consistency. But every assemblage also has lines of deterritorialization, tendencies to break up, transform, open onto something else. The book develops this concept through multiple domains. A music assemblage includes instruments, bodies that play them, acoustics of spaces, notation systems, genres, audiences. It is territorialized. A concert hall, a recording studio, a specific tradition. But it can deterritorialize. An instrument can be used in new ways, genres can merge, sounds can escape tonal systems. The assemblage holds together, but is also always changing, always opening onto lines of flight. Becoming is another major concept, developed across several plateaus. Becoming is not imitation or resemblance. It is a real transformation that happens between terms without either term ceasing to be what it is. Becoming animal is not becoming an animal literally. It is entering into composition with an animal, forming a multiplicity, a pack, an assemblage where the human and animal become indiscernible without either being annulled. Deleuze and Guattari give examples. Lovecraft's becoming crustacean, where the writer feels himself transforming into something inhuman, feeling sensations that are not human sensations. Kafka's becoming animal, where Gregor Samsa wakes up transformed into an insect, but the transformation is real in the text, not a symbol or metaphor. These are not fantasies. They are becomings, real processes where identity loosens, where new capacities emerge, where what you can do and feel changes. There are many becomings: becoming woman, becoming child, becoming imperceptible. Becoming woman is not women imitating stereotypes. It is a molecular process, an undoing of molar identity, a passage toward flexibility and variation. Becoming child is not acting childish. It is recovering capacities of experimentation, of play, of relation to the world that organized adulthood has shut down. Becoming imperceptible is the limit, where all identity dissolves, where you become indistinguishable from your milieu, where subjectivity itself is undone. The body without organs returns, now more fully developed. The body without organs is produced. You make it. It is not something you discover inside yourself. The practice involves undoing the organism, suspending the hierarchical organization of organs and functions, opening the body to intensities that do not respect functional boundaries. This is difficult and dangerous. If you go too fast, if you destroy organization entirely, you get the catatonic body, the frozen body without capacity. The body without organs must be produced carefully, experimentally, with caution. Deleuze and Guattari distinguish different types of bodies without organs: the hypochondriac body, which perceives organs as persecutory; the paranoid body, which forms a defensive surface against external threats; the drugged body, which uses substances to alter organization; the masochistic body, which uses pain to undo fixed distributions of pleasure. Each is an experiment, a way of relating to the organism differently, of finding intensities beyond organized experience. But the body without organs is not a goal. It is a limit, an asymptote. You approach it but never fully reach it. The question is always, how far can you go? What experiments are possible? What new connections can be made? The body without organs is a practice, not a state. It is something you construct continuously, negotiating between the rigidity of the organism and the dissolution of catatonia. The plateau on the state and the war machine develops a political analysis. The state is an apparatus of capture. It captures flows, organizes them hierarchically, establishes sovereignty. The war machine is exterior to the state. It is nomadic, operates in smooth space, refuses capture. But the state can appropriate the war machine, turn it into a military apparatus. Then the war machine serves the state instead of opposing it. This is not a historical thesis about actual states and armies. It is a conceptual analysis of two poles in any social formation. The state pole organizes, stratifies, codes. The war machine pole deterritorializes, escapes, creates lines of flight. Political struggle is the conflict between these tendencies, not the conflict between classes or the struggle for state power. Revolution is not seizing the state. It is forming war machines that escape state capture. The Plateau on Becoming develops the idea of minoritarian versus majoritarian. The majoritarian is not a numerical majority. It is a standard, a norm, a model that claims to represent everyone. In Western societies, the majoritarian is white, male, adult, heterosexual, urban. This is the implicit norm against which variations are measured. The minoritarian is not a numerical minority. It is a variation, a deviation, a becoming that escapes the norm. Minoritarian politics does not claim to represent a group. It creates becomings, opens lines of flight, refuses the majoritarian standard. The Plateau on Smooth and Striated Space analyzes different modes of organization. Striated space is organized by fixed points, grid patterns, measurements. The city is striated: streets, blocks, addresses. The desert is smooth: no fixed points, no prescribed paths, navigation by signs and variations. But smooth and striated are not absolute. Every smooth space can be striated. Every striated space has smooth elements. The question is, which tendency dominates? Which mode of organization prevails? The book is difficult because it refuses to be systematic. It does not build toward a conclusion. It does not synthesize its concepts into a unified theory. Each plateau operates independently. Concepts recur, but in different contexts, transformed by new connections. You cannot summarize the book because there is no single argument to extract. You can only describe it, map it, trace the connections between concepts, follow the lines of flight that open across plateaus. The writing style is also different from Anti-Oedipus. There are more diagrams, more typologies, more concrete examples. The tone is less polemical, less focused on critique, more interested in construction. Where Anti-Oedipus attacked Oedipus and psychoanalysis, 1,000 Plateaus builds assemblages, develops concepts, explores territories. The shift is from destruction to creation, from critique to production. The book has been enormously influential, but often in fragmentary ways. People take up the Rhizome without reading the rest. They use deterritorialization as a slogan without understanding its relation to reterritorialization. They romanticize nomadism without attending to the analysis of capture. The concepts circulate independently of the assemblage that produced them. This is both inevitable and problematic. Inevitable because concepts have their own life. They can be adapted to new contexts, used in ways their creators did not anticipate. Problematic because detached from their conceptual machinery, they can become vague gestures, buzzwords without precision. 1,000 Plateaus is the fullest expression of Deleuze and Guattari's collaborative method. It enacts the rhizome it describes. It refuses hierarchy, refuses systematicity, operates by connection and assemblage. You enter anywhere, follow whichever line interests you, make your own connections. The book is an experiment in thinking differently, in writing differently, in constructing concepts that do not fit the mold of philosophical argument. It is one of the strangest, most radical texts in 20th century philosophy. The question it poses: what if thought did not have to be systematic, unified, hierarchical? What if philosophy was not about building systems, but about making connections, constructing assemblages, opening lines of flight. What if concepts were tools for experimentation rather than representations of reality? 1,000 Plateaus answers by example, by enacting a mode of thought that is genuinely rhizomatic, that resists capture, even as it produces concepts of extraordinary precision and power. A body is not an organism. The organism is a particular organization of the body, a distribution of organs and functions into a hierarchical system. The heart pumps blood, the lungs exchange gases, the stomach digests food. Each organ has a function within the organized whole. Medicine treats bodies as organisms, identifying dysfunctions and restoring proper functioning. But for Deleuze and Guattari, the organism is only one possible organization of the body. It is not the body itself. The body is what Spinoza calls a composition of relations. A body is defined by the relations between its parts, between particles, between organs, between systems. These relations are dynamic, not static. They can change, they can break down, they can be reorganized. The body is not a fixed entity, but a process, an assemblage that holds together as long as its relations continue to function. When the relations break down, the body ceases to be that body. Spinoza defines things by their effects. An affect is not an emotion, though emotions are one kind of effect. An affect is a capacity to affect or be affected, to produce changes in other bodies or to undergo changes from other bodies. A poison affects the body by disrupting its relations. A medicine affects the body by restoring them. Food affects the body by providing energy. Exercise affects the body by strengthening capacities. Every encounter between bodies produces affects. This leads to Spinoza's ethical question: what increases your power of acting and what decreases it? Ethics is not about obeying moral laws or conforming to norms. It is about understanding which compositions are joyful and which are sad, which encounters increase your capacities and which diminish them. Joy is the passage to greater perfection, greater power. Sadness is the passage to lesser perfection, lesser power. The ethical task is to seek compositions that are joyful, that enhance power, that open new capacities. Deleuze makes this Spinozist ethic central to his own thought. We do not know in advance what will increase our power. We discover it through experimentation, through forming assemblages, through testing what works and what does not. A body's capacities are not predetermined. They emerge through encounters, through compositions with other bodies, through the formation of new relations. The body without organs is the name for this experimental relation to the body. It is not a rejection of the organism, but a refusal to be limited by the organism's functional organization. The body without organs is produced by undoing fixed distributions, by opening the body to intensities that do not respect organ boundaries, by experimenting with what the body can do beyond its assigned functions. Artaud described this as the body without organs against the organized body imposed by God, by the medical establishment, by society. He experienced his own body as colonized by external judgments, by prescriptions about how it should function, by treatments that reinforced organization at the cost of intensity. The body without organs was his attempt to reclaim the body from these external determinations, to find intensities that belong to the body itself rather than to the organizing systems imposed on it. Deleuze and Guattari developed this as a practice. You construct a body without organs by suspending the organism's functioning, by attending to intensities rather than functions, by forming new connections that the organism would prohibit. This can happen through drugs, through sexuality, through meditation, through illness, through art. Each is a way of undoing organization, of finding intensities beyond organized experience. But the practice is dangerous. If you destroy the organism entirely, you lose the capacity to function, to connect, to produce. You get catatonia, the frozen body, the body without any capacity for response. The body without organs is not a goal to be reached by destroying all organization. It is an asymptote, a limit that you approach carefully, experimentally, testing how far you can go without losing the capacity for connection. Deleuze and Guattari give a formula. Lodge yourself on a stratum, experiment with the opportunities it offers, find an advantageous place on it, find potential movements of deterritorialization, possible lines of flight, experience them, produce flows of conjunction here and there, try out continuums of intensities, segment by segment, have a small plot of new land at all times. This is the practice of the body without organs, not destruction, but experimentation, not escaping organization entirely, but finding where it can be undone, where new connections can be made, where intensities can flow without being captured by functional demands. The question of what a body can do is also a question about composition. Bodies compose with other bodies, forming larger assemblages. Two bodies in a sexual relation compose a new assemblage with capacities neither has alone. A rider and a horse compose a new assemblage, the centaur assemblage, which is neither human nor horse, but a composition with its own capacities. A musician and an instrument compose an assemblage that produces sounds, effects, intensities. These compositions are not additions. When bodies compose, they do not simply add their capacities together. They create new capacities, new modes of affecting and being affected. The assemblage can do things its components cannot do separately. This is why Deleuze and Guattari emphasize assemblages rather than individuals. The individual is an abstraction. What exists are assemblages, compositions, relations between bodies that produce effects. This has implications for subjectivity. The subject is not a substance, not a fixed identity, not a transcendental ground. The subject is an effect of assemblages, a provisional unity produced through the composition of bodies. When you say I, you are naming an assemblage, a body, a set of capacities, a network of relations. This assemblage can be reorganized, can form different compositions, can become different without ceasing to function. Spinoza's parallelism is crucial here. Mind and body are not two substances that interact. They are two attributes of the same substance, two ways of expressing the same thing. An idea in the mind corresponds to an affection of the body. An affect in the body corresponds to a change in the mind. There is no causal relation between them because they are not separate. They are the same process read in two registers. Deleuze uses this to reject psychosomatic dualism. The psychosomatic symptom is not the mind causing a bodily problem. It is the same process expressed in both mind and body. The body's wound and the mind's trauma are not cause and effect. They are parallel expressions of the same event, the same transformation. To address one without the other is to miss how they are inseparable aspects of the same assemblage. This brings ethics back to experimentation. You do not know in advance what compositions will be joyful. You cannot deduce from general principles which encounters will increase your power. You must experiment, you must test, you must form assemblages and see what they can do. This is not relativism. Some compositions genuinely increase power, others diminish it. But the determination is pragmatic, not moral. It is based on effects, on what actually happens when bodies compose, not on conformity to norms. Nietzsche converges with Spinoza here. Nietzsche's question, what does an action express? Does it express active forces or reactive forces? Does it affirm or does it negate? The answer cannot be determined by the action itself, only by what it expresses by the forces that produce it. An action that looks moral might express reactive forces, guilt, resentment, weakness, disguised as virtue. An action that looks immoral might express active forces, creation, affirmation, strength. Deleuze synthesizes Spinoza and Nietzsche into an ethics of affirmation and joy. Affirmation in the Nietzschean sense, saying yes to life, to becoming, to difference. Joy in the Spinozist sense, the passage to greater power, the composition with other bodies that enhances rather than diminishes. The ethical question becomes, how do you compose with others in ways that are joyful? How do you form assemblages that increase power rather than capture or diminish it? This is also a politics. Political struggle is not primarily about ideology or consciousness. It is about assemblages, about which compositions prevail, about whether assemblages are organized hierarchically or rhizomatically, about whether connections enhance power or extract it. Capitalism organizes assemblages to extract surplus value, to channel power toward capital accumulation. The state organizes assemblages to establish sovereignty, to maintain hierarchies. Resistance means forming assemblages that escape these organizations, that find lines of flight, that create new capacities. The body politic is not metaphorical. Social formations are assemblages of bodies, human bodies, technological bodies, architectural bodies, institutional bodies. These assemble according to certain principles, form certain relations, produce certain effects. Politics is the struggle over how these assemblages are organized, which capacities they enhance, which they suppress, which lines of flight they open or close. Deleuze's engagement with ethology, the study of animal behavior, is relevant here. Ethology describes what animals do, what their capacities are, how they relate to their environment. It does not reduce behavior to instinct or intelligence. It asks, what can this animal do? What are its effects, its modes of relating, its ways of navigating its world? Spinoza's ethics is an ethology of human beings, not what humans are essentially, but what they can do, what enhances or diminishes their power. The question remains open. We do not know what a body can do. Each encounter is an experiment, a test of capacities, a discovery of new possibilities. The body is not fixed. It can be organized differently, can form new assemblages, can develop new capacities. This is what makes ethics necessary. If the body were predetermined, if its capacities were given, ethics would be a matter of conforming to nature. But because the body is open, because its capacities are discovered through experimentation, ethics becomes the art of composition, the practice of forming assemblages that are joyful, that increase power, that open new modes of affecting and being affected. This is Deleuze's answer to the question, what is a body? Not a substance or an essence, but a composition of relations, a set of capacities, an assemblage that holds together provisionally and can be reorganized. The body is what it does, what it can do, what it discovers it can do through encounters with other bodies. Ethics is the practice of discovering these capacities, of forming compositions that enhance rather than diminish, of finding joy rather than sadness. Politics is the organization of bodies into assemblages, the struggle over which assemblages prevail, which capacities are developed, which lines of flight remain open. In 1983, Deleuze published Cinema 1. The Movement Image, followed in 1985 by Cinema 2, The Time Image. These were not works of film theory in the conventional sense, not semiotics, not ideology critique, not narrative analysis. They were philosophy through cinema, using cinema as a way to think about movement, time, perception, and thought itself. Cinema gave Deleuze access to problems that could not be approached through language or abstract concepts alone. The project began with Bergson. Bergson had criticized cinema as incapable of grasping real movement, real duration. Cinema for Bergson was a series of static frames projected in sequence, creating the illusion of movement, but not capturing movement itself. Real movement is continuous, qualitative, indivisible. Cinema breaks movement into discrete positions, into instants that are then mechanically reproduced. It gives us false movement, what Bergson called the cinematographic illusion. Deleuze inverted Bergson's critique. Cinema does not produce false movement by reproducing static instants. Modern cinema produces the movement image, an image that is intrinsically mobile, that captures movement itself rather than positions through which something moves. The camera moves. The frame moves. The image presents movement directly, not as the sum of static positions, but as a continuous variation. Cinema can grasp what Bergson said it could not, the becoming of movement, duration made visible. This required rethinking what an image is. An image is not a representation that corresponds to an external object. An image is a set of relations, a composition of movements and affects, a way of presenting the world. The movement image is how cinema presents movement, not by reproducing it, but by creating it, by making movement the substance of the image itself. The image moves, and this movement is real, not illusory. Deleuze develops a taxonomy of movement images drawn from Bergson's analysis of perception, affection, and action. The perception image is what shows how things appear to a perceiving consciousness. The affection image captures effects on faces or in close-ups, emotions, intensities that are expressed but not yet acted upon. The action image shows the sensory-motor schema. Perception leads to action, stimulus to response, situation to behavior. Classical cinema operates primarily through action images. A character perceives a situation, Janvier 26, processes it, and acts accordingly. The narrative is driven by this sensory-motor schema: situation, action, new situation. The viewer follows the character's perceptions and actions, understanding the world through their engagement with it. Hollywood perfected this model: clear motivations, decisive actions, resolutions that restore equilibrium. The movement image in classical cinema is subordinated to narrative, to the unfolding of a story through action. Deleuze distinguishes different national cinemas according to how they treat the movement image. Soviet montage cinema, Eisenstein, Pudovkin, Vertov, creates dialectical images where movements collide, producing new meanings through juxtaposition. German Expressionism creates affection images where the world itself expresses inner states, where space becomes psychological. French Impressionism focuses on perception images, on how things appear to consciousness, on the mobility of point of view. American cinema develops the action image most fully, creating clear sensory-motor situations where perception leads to action. But something changes after World War II. The sensory-motor schema breaks down. Characters perceive situations but cannot act. They wander through environments that resist action. The link between perception and response fractures. This produces a new kind of image, the time image. The time image presents time directly rather than indirectly through movement. In the movement image, time is derived from movement. Time is the measure of movement, the interval between positions. In the time image, time is presented in itself, not as the measure of something else. The image no longer extends into action. It opens onto duration, onto the thickness of time, onto the coexistence of past and present. Deleuze traces this shift through post-war European cinema. Italian neo-realism, Rossellini, De Sica, Visconti create situations that are purely optical and sound, detached from action. A child wanders through bombed-out Rome, seeing things but unable to change them. A woman stands on a beach perceiving without acting. These are not failures of action, but a new relation to the image, one where seeing exceeds the sensory motor schema. French New Wave cinema, Godard, Resnais, Roma, intensifies this break. Characters engage in endless conversations that lead nowhere. Time becomes visible as time, not the time of clocks but duration, the coexistence of multiple temporalities. Resnais's Last Year at Marienbad presents a past that may not have happened, a present that cannot be determined, a future that remains suspended. Time is no longer the subordinate variable of movement. Time becomes the primary reality that the image presents. The crystal image is Deleuze's concept for images where time crystallizes, where the virtual and the actual become indiscernible. In certain images, mirrors, reflections, memory flashbacks, the actual image and its virtual double exist simultaneously. You cannot tell which is real and which is reflection. This indiscernibility is not confusion. It is the structure of time itself, the coexistence of past and present, the way the virtual conditions the actual without being separate from it. Wells's films are exemplary. Citizen Kane presents multiple pasts that do not converge into a single truth. The Magnificent Ambersons shows the past haunting the present, refusing to stay past. The Lady from Shanghai climaxes in a hall of mirrors where actual and virtual multiply endlessly. These are not tricks or effects. They are presentations of time's structure, of how the virtual and the actual interpenetrate. The time image also includes what Deleuze calls sheets of past. Bergson's model, the past does not succeed the present, it coexists with it. Memory is not stored and retrieved. Memory is a virtual dimension, the totality of the past that is always present as past. Different regions of the past, different degrees of contraction and relaxation, coexist as sheets or layers. When you remember, you jump to a particular sheet, actualizing a particular region of the past. Resnais's cinema operates according to this model. Hiroshima Mon Amour moves between different temporal layers. The present in Hiroshima, the past in Nevers, the wartime trauma that connects them. These layers coexist. They do not succeed each other chronologically. The film presents the sheets of past directly, showing how they interpenetrate with the present. Last Year at Marienbad goes further, making it impossible to determine which layer is present and which is past, which is memory and which is imagination. Japanese cinema, particularly Ozu and Mizoguchi, presents another version of the time image. Ozu's late films are characterized by pillow shots, images that have no narrative function, that simply present space and time. A vase, a corridor, a landscape, these images do not advance the story. They present dead time, empty spaces, the world continuing independently of human action. They are pure optical and sound images, detached from the sensory motor schema. Ozu's camera rarely moves. It observes from a fixed position, often at floor level, creating what Deleuze calls the still life. Not still life as a genre of painting, but life stilled, life presented in its duration rather than its movement. Characters come and go, but the camera remains, presenting the space they have vacated, the time that continues without them. These images are contemplative, presenting time in its passing, duration as the substance of life. The distinction between movement image and time image is not historical in a simple sense. It is not that all cinema before 1945 was movement image, and all cinema after was time image. Both types exist in all periods, but the time image becomes dominant after the war, becomes the defining possibility of modern cinema. And this shift reflects a broader transformation, the breakdown of action, the crisis of sensory motor schemas, the need to think time directly rather than through movement. Deleuze's method is taxonomic but not empiricist. He does not induce categories from examples. He constructs concepts: the perception image, the affection image, the action image, the crystal image, the sheet of past, and then shows how specific films actualize these concepts. The concepts are philosophical, drawn from Bergson primarily, but also from Peirce's semiotics, from Spinoza's theory of affects, from Nietzsche's eternal return. Cinema becomes a way of testing these concepts, of seeing how they function in actual images. This makes the cinema books different from Deleuze's other work. They are more descriptive, more engaged with specific examples, less abstract. But they are no less philosophical. Each image type is a concept, a way of thinking movement or time or effect. Each film is an actualization of these concepts, a way of making them visible. Philosophy thinks through concepts. Cinema thinks through images. But both are modes of thought, different ways of engaging with the real. The books cover an extraordinary range of filmmakers: Eisenstein, Vertov, and Dovzhenko from Soviet cinema, Lang, Murnau, and Pabst from German Expressionism, Hitchcock and Ford from Hollywood, Wells, Renoir, and Bresson from various national traditions, Ozu and Mizoguchi from Japan, Godard, Resnais, Roma, and Rivette from French New Wave, Antonioni, Fellini, and the Taviani brothers from Italy. Each is treated not as an auteur whose personal vision determines their films, but as someone who creates concepts through images, who makes cinema think. Hitchcock is analysed through the mental image, the image that presents thought itself, that shows relations rather than objects. Hitchcock's films are chains of relations, suspense created through what characters know and do not know, through the gap between knowledge and action. The famous example, the bomb under the table. The audience knows it is there. The characters do not. This creates a relation between what is seen and what is known, between image and knowledge, that is the substance of suspense. Godard is analysed through his break with the movement image. Godard's films refuse the sensory motor schema. Characters speak, but their words do not lead to action. Images are beautiful, but do not extend into movement. Time becomes visible as gaps, intervals, dead time. Weekend ends with the collapse of cinema itself, the image breaking down into letters, into text, into the impossibility of continuing. Godard makes cinema think about its own conditions, about what it can and cannot present. The cinema books are also about thought. How does cinema make us think? Not by representing ideas or illustrating concepts, but by creating images that force thought. When the sensory motor schema breaks down, when perception no longer extends into action, the viewer cannot simply follow the narrative. The image demands thought, demands that the viewer actively engage with what is presented. The time image forces thought because it cannot be processed through recognition, through applying familiar schemas. Deleuze distinguishes three kinds of images in relation to thought. First, images that represent thought, the cliché, the stereotype, the image that confirms what we already know. Second, images that resist thought, the shocking image, the intolerable image, the image that cannot be processed. Third, images that create thought, images that open new possibilities, that make visible what was not thinkable before. Modern cinema operates at the third level. It does not represent thought or simply shock the viewer. It creates conditions for thinking differently, for engaging with time and movement and perception in ways that were not possible before cinema. This is why Deleuze says cinema is the art of the masses, not because it is popular, but because it creates new forms of collective perception, new ways of experiencing time and movement that transform what it means to think. The books end with a question: what comes after the time image? Deleuze was writing in the early 80s, before digital cinema, before CGI, before the transformations that would come with new technologies. He suggests that cinema may be exhausted, may have explored the possibilities of the movement image and the time image to their limits. What would a new kind of image be? He does not answer. The question remains open. The cinema books are among Deleuze's most accessible works. They engage with films people have seen, with directors people know. They are less abstract than difference and repetition, less polemical than Anti-Oedipus, less fragmented than 1,000 Plateaus. But they are no less rigorous. Each concept is precisely defined. Each analysis is carefully argued. The books show that thinking through images is as rigorous as thinking through language. That cinema is a philosophical practice, that the visible is not opposed to thought but a condition for thinking. For Deleuze, cinema mattered because it made visible what philosophy could only describe: the coexistence of past and present, the breakdown of action, the direct presentation of time. These are concepts Deleuze developed in Difference and Repetition and Logic of Sense. But cinema actualizes them, makes them perceptible, shows them in operation. This is why the cinema books are essential to understanding Deleuze's project. They show his concepts working, functioning, producing effects in a domain outside philosophy proper. The question the books pose: what can images do? Not what they represent or signify, but what they make possible, what capacities they have, what relations they create. This is the same question Deleuze asks about bodies, about concepts, about assemblages. Images are not representations. They are real productions, material forces, ways of making the world thinkable and perceptible. Cinema thinks, not with concepts, but with images, but thinking nonetheless. The answer: philosophy is the discipline that creates concepts, not discovers concepts, as if concepts existed independently, waiting to be found. Not analyzes concepts, as if philosophy's task were to clarify meanings already present in language. Creates. Philosophy invents concepts, fabricates them, gives them consistency and life. The concept is philosophy's specific creation, what philosophy alone produces. This is a strong claim. It means philosophy cannot be reduced to conceptual analysis, to the clarification of ordinary language, to the examination of implicit assumptions. These activities may be valuable, but they are not philosophy in the full sense. Philosophy proper is creative. It makes concepts that did not exist before, that have their own reality, that can be applied in domains their creators never anticipated. What is a concept? Not a general idea or an abstract representation. A concept is an intensive multiplicity, a set of components that are heterogeneous but inseparable. The concept of the rhizome includes principles: connection, heterogeneity, multiplicity, a signifying rupture, cartography, decalcomania. These components are distinct, but they define the rhizome together. Remove one and you have a different concept. The components do not exist before the concept. They are created with it, through it. Every concept has a history. It responds to problems. It inherits from earlier concepts. It transforms what it takes up. The concept of the body without organs comes from Artaud, but is transformed by Deleuze and Guattari. The concept of the virtual comes from Bergson, but is developed in new directions. The concept of intensity comes from thermodynamics but is given ontological significance. Each concept has precursors, but each is new, each creates something that was not there before. Concepts are created on a plane of immanence. The plane of immanence is not a concept, but the horizon of concepts, the field on which they are constructed. It is immanence without anything immanent to it. Immanence, immanent only to itself. The plane is not prior to concepts, it is constructed along with them, but it is distinct from them. The plane is the image of thought that philosophy presupposes, the orientation that makes certain concepts possible and others impossible. Different philosophies construct different planes of immanence. Descartes' plane is organized around the thinking subject, around clear and distinct ideas, around the separation of mind and body. Spinoza's plane is organized around substance, around the identity of God and nature, around immanence without transcendence. Kant's plane is organized around transcendental conditions, around the limits of possible experience, around the distinction between phenomena and noumena. Each plane makes certain concepts possible, excludes others, determines what can be thought. The plane of immanence is singular to each philosophy. There is no universal plane that all philosophers share. But neither are planes arbitrary. They respond to problems, they have consistency, they determine what concepts can be constructed on them. Creating a new philosophy means constructing a new plane, not just inventing new concepts. Deleuze and Guattari's plane is organized around multiplicity, becoming difference, immanence without transcendence. Their concepts, rhizome, assemblage, body without organs, deterritorialization, are possible only on this plane. Philosophy is distinct from science. Science does not create concepts, it creates functions. A function is a relation between independent variables, a mathematical or experimental determination of how things vary together. Science operates on a plane of reference, not a plane of immanence. The plane of reference is constructed through coordinates, measurements, observers. It is the space where functions are defined, where experiments are conducted, where things are observed and measured. Science and philosophy are not opposed. They are different modes of thought, different ways of engaging with chaos. Chaos is not disorder, but the infinite speed at which forms appear and disappear, at which every determination is immediately undone. Thought cannot engage chaos directly. It must slow down, must create consistencies that can be thought. Science slows chaos by creating functions, by establishing regularities, by finding laws. Philosophy slows chaos by creating concepts, by giving consistency to multiplicities, by making thought possible. Art is a third mode of thought. Art creates affects and percepts, not affections, which are states of subjects, but affects which are intensities that exceed subjects. Not perceptions, which are subjective experiences, but percepts which are beings of sensation that exist independently of those who perceive them. A painting creates affects and percepts, intensities of colour, compositions of form, that have their own reality. They are not representations of a subject's experience. They are sensations made autonomous, given a life of their own. Art operates on a plane of composition. This is not the same as the plane of immanence or the plane of reference. The plane of composition is where effects and percepts are composed, where sensations are given consistency, where art creates beings of sensation. A painting, a piece of music, a novel. Each creates effects and percepts that did not exist before, that have their own reality independently of their creator and their audience. The three modes of thought, philosophy, science, art, are irreducible. None can be translated into the others. Philosophy cannot be reduced to science. Concepts are not functions. The plane of immanence is not the plane of reference. Science cannot be reduced to philosophy. Functions are not concepts. Observation is not the same as conceptual creation. Art cannot be reduced to either. Effects and percepts are not concepts or functions. Each discipline thinks but differently. But they can resonate. A scientific function can inspire a philosophical concept. An artistic effect can provoke conceptual creation. A philosophical concept can suggest new directions for science or art. There are zones of interference, moments where the disciplines touch, where concepts and functions and affects enter into proximity. But the proximity does not dissolve their differences. Each remains autonomous. Each has its own task. Deleuze and Guattari distinguish philosophy from opinion. Opinion is doxa, common sense, what everyone already knows. Philosophy is not the clarification of opinion. It is the creation of concepts that break with opinion, that make thought move differently. The friend in philosophy, the philosopher is a friend of wisdom, is not someone who agrees with you. The friend is the rival, the competitor, the one who forces you to think, who will not let you rest in opinion. Philosophy also faces enemies. The great enemy is transcendence. Transcendence introduces an outside, God, the subject, the law, that would ground or judge or explain the immanent field. Plato's forms transcend the sensible world. Christian theology makes God transcendent to creation. Kant makes the transcendental subject the condition of experience. Each introduces a transcendence that organizes the immanent, that gives it meaning from outside. Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy is radically immanent. There is no outside, no transcendent ground or goal, no higher unity that would subsume differences. Everything is on the plane of immanence. Differences are real, but they are differences on the plane, not differences between the plane and something beyond it. Philosophy has no recourse to anything outside thought itself. Immanence all the way down. This makes their philosophy distinctive. It is not phenomenology. Consciousness is not the ground. It is not existentialism. Existence is not primary. It is not structuralism. Structures do not determine everything. It is not post-structuralism. There is more than play and deferral. It is a philosophy of immanence, of multiplicity, of difference, of becoming. A philosophy that creates concepts adequate to a world without transcendence, without hierarchy, without fixed essences. The book also addresses the conceptual persona. The conceptual persona is not the philosopher as biographical individual. It is the figure who inhabits the plane of immanence, who thinks through the concepts constructed there. Socrates is a conceptual persona, the gadfly, the midwife, the one who questions. Descartes' persona is the doubter who rebuilds knowledge from foundations. Nietzsche's persona is Zarathustra, the teacher of the eternal return. Each persona is created along with the concepts, embodies the mode of thought the philosophy proposes. Deleuze and Guattari's conceptual persona might be the nomad, the schizo, the one who follows lines of flight, who refuses capture, who thinks rhizomatically. But the persona is not fixed. It shifts across their work, takes different forms, embodies different possibilities. The conceptual persona is not the author, but the figure of thought that the concepts require, the one who can think what the concepts make thinkable. The book is reflective but not nostalgic. It does not mourn philosophy's past or worry about its future. It affirms philosophy's necessity. Philosophy is needed because only philosophy creates concepts. Only philosophy thinks on a plane of immanence. Only philosophy can give consistency to multiplicities without reducing them to unities. Science needs philosophy to think its foundations, its concepts, its implicit assumptions. Art needs philosophy to think what it creates, to understand affects and percepts as modes of thought. Culture needs philosophy to resist opinion, to break with common sense, to create new possibilities for thinking. But philosophy is not foundational. It does not ground science or art. It does not provide ultimate justifications. It simply does its own work, creating concepts, constructing planes of immanence, making thought possible in domains where recognition fails. Philosophy is autonomous but not isolated. It engages with science and art, with politics and culture, with the problems of its time. But it engages philosophically by creating concepts, not by applying pre-existing theories or methods. What is philosophy? Is Deleuze and Guattari's defense of philosophy their explanation of what they had been doing for 2 decades of collaboration? But it is also a provocation. It challenges philosophers to create, to construct new concepts, to build new planes of immanence. It challenges readers to think, to engage with concepts as tools for thought, to use philosophy for experimentation rather than contemplation. It is a testament and an invitation. The question remains, what is philosophy? The answer is not a definition but a practice. Philosophy is what philosophers do when they create concepts, when they construct planes of immanence, when they give consistency to chaos, when they make thought possible. Philosophy is not a discipline with fixed boundaries or methods. It is an activity, a creation, a way of thinking that is always beginning again, always constructing new concepts for new problems. The phrase is Spinoza's, Deus sive natura, God or nature. Not God and nature as two separate things, but God as nature, nature as God, the identity of substance. There is only one substance, and everything that exists is a mode of that substance. There is no creator separate from creation, no transcendent being who would judge or govern from outside. God is the immanent cause of all things, internal to what is caused, not external. This is immanence in its most rigorous form. Deleuze makes Spinoza's immanence the foundation of his own philosophy, but he transforms it. Spinoza's substance is eternal, unchanging, necessary. Deleuze's plane of immanence is productive, temporal, contingent. It is not a being that grounds other beings. It is a field of differences, a process of actualization, a movement of becoming. The plane of immanence is immanence without anything immanent to it. Pure immanence, immanent only to itself. What does this mean? It means there is no subject to whom things are immanent. There is no consciousness that experiences immanence. There is no substance that would be the support for immanent properties. The plane of immanence is not immanent to anything. It is immanence itself, the absolute horizon, the field on which everything takes place. This is difficult to think. We are accustomed to immanence being immanent to something. Experience is immanent to consciousness. Properties are immanent to substances. Effects are immanent to causes. But Deleuze wants immanence without relation to anything outside itself. Pure immanence, absolute immanence, immanence that is its own ground. The plane of immanence is life, not biological life, not the life of organisms, but a life, impersonal, singular, neither individual nor general. Deleuze's last published text, Immanence. A life describes this. A life is not the life of a subject. It is pure event, pure virtuality, the field of potentials that actualizes into particular lives without being exhausted by them. A life is what persists between birth and death, what continues when the individual ceases, what makes individuation possible without being individual itself. Dickens's character, dying on the street, enters a life. Between life and death, in the suspended moment when identity dissolves, there is a life, impersonal, unqualified, open. This is not mysticism, it is ontology. A life is the transcendental field, but transcendental in a new sense, not the conditions of possible experience, but the virtual dimension that is real without being actual, that conditions actual experience without being separate from it. The plane of immanence is constructed. It does not pre-exist philosophy. Each philosophy constructs its plane, lays out the image of thought that will determine what concepts can be created. But the plane is not arbitrary. It responds to problems. It has consistency. It determines what can be thought. Deleuze's plane is constructed through his readings of Spinoza, Bergson, Nietzsche. It is a plane of pure difference, of becoming, of multiplicity without unity. On this plane, concepts are created: the rhizome, the body without organs, the virtual and the actual, assemblage, deterritorialization, becoming, intensity, the time image. Each is a concept constructed on the plane of immanence. Each gives consistency to some region of the plane, makes some aspect of immanence thinkable. But the concepts do not exhaust the plane. The plane is infinite, inexhaustible. There are always more concepts to be created, more regions to be given consistency. Immanence is opposed to transcendence at every point. Transcendence introduces an outside, a God who creates, a subject who constitutes, a law that judges, a goal that orients. Transcendence makes the immanent derivative, secondary, dependent. It explains the world by reference to something beyond the world. Deleuze rejects this absolutely. There is no beyond. There is only the plane of immanence, the field of differences, the process of actualization. This has ethical implications. Without transcendent values, without a God who commands or a law that obligates, ethics becomes immanent. It becomes a question of composition. What assemblages increase power? What connections are joyful? What becomings open new capacities? Ethics is not obedience. It is experimentation, the art of living, the practice of forming assemblages that enhance rather than diminish. It has political implications. Without a transcendent state or sovereign, politics becomes immanent. It becomes a question of assemblages. What organizations capture flows? What apparatuses extract surplus value? What lines of flight remain open? Politics is not about seizing power. It is about forming assemblages that escape capture, that create new possibilities, that resist the transcendent impositions of state and capital. It has ontological implications. Without transcendent being, ontology becomes immanent. Being is becoming, substance is process. Identity is produced through difference. There is no ground beneath, no principle above. There is only the plane of immanence, the field where differences actualize, where multiplicities compose, where becoming happens without tending toward a final state. Deleuze died on November 4th, 1995. He fell from his apartment window, the window he could no longer breathe near, the window that opened onto a world his body could no longer engage. His death was his decision, made with clarity about what his life had become. He left no note, no explanation, no final statement. But his work remains, the concepts, the books, the invitation to think immanence. What remains is not a system to be applied or a doctrine to be followed. What remains is a set of concepts, tools for thinking, instruments for making thought move differently. The rhizome is available for anyone who wants to think non-hierarchically, who wants to make connections across heterogeneous domains. The body without organs is available for anyone experimenting with how to undo organization without destroying capacity. The virtual and the actual are available for thinking genesis, production, the emergence of the new. These concepts have their own life. They circulate independently of their creator. They are applied in contexts Deleuze never anticipated, geography, architecture, music theory, digital media, organizational theory. They are sometimes misunderstood, simplified, reduced to slogans. But they continue to work, to produce effects, to make thought possible in domains where recognition fails. This is what Deleuze wanted: concepts that function, that have use, that do not require authority to legitimate them. The question the work poses is still urgent: how to think immanence, how to think without recourse to transcendence, without ground or guarantee, without fixed identities or predetermined ends. How to think difference without subordinating it to identity. How to think becoming without anchoring it in being. How to think multiplicities without reducing them to unities. These are not abstract problems. They are the problems of living in a world without transcendence, without foundations, without the comforts of hierarchy and order. Deleuze's answer is not a solution, but a practice. Think through concepts. Create concepts adequate to the problems you face. Construct assemblages that increase power. Find lines of flight that escape capture. Form compositions that are joyful. Experiment with what bodies can do. Resist the apparatuses of capture. State, capital, identity. Stay on the plane of immanence. No transcendence, no outside, no ground beyond the process itself. This is what it means to encounter thought, not the gentle exercise of a faculty that naturally seeks truth, but the violence of something from outside that forces you to think, that will not let you recognize what you already know, that demands the creation of new concepts. Deleuze's work is such an encounter. It strikes, it disturbs, it will not be assimilated to familiar frameworks. It forces thought. The opening question returns: what forces us to think? Not wonder, not doubt, not method, but an encounter with what cannot be recognized, what exceeds the coordinates of the faculties, what demands creation rather than application. Art can force thought, an image that presents time directly, a painting that creates effects you have never felt. Experience can force thought, an intensity that will not fit into qualities, a becoming that dissolves identity. Philosophy can force thought, a concept that opens possibilities you could not see before. Deleuze created such concepts: the virtual that is real without being actual, the body without organs that is not a body that lacks organs, but a body freed from organization. The rhizome that has no center, no hierarchy, no beginning or end. The plane of immanence that is not immanent to anything but itself. These are not easy concepts. They do not make things simpler. They do not resolve problems into solutions. They create new problems, new ways of thinking, new possibilities. The plane of immanence is not a place you reach. It is where you always already are. There is no outside to escape to, no transcendence to appeal to. There is only immanence, the field of differences, the process of becoming, the actualization of the virtual through divergent paths. To think immanence is to think without transcendence, to accept that there is no ground beneath and no goal above, that everything is on the same plane, that differences are real without needing a transcendent unity to organize them. This is Deleuze's legacy, a philosophy of immanence, of difference, of becoming, of multiplicity. A philosophy that creates concepts rather than discovers truths, that makes thought move rather than representing reality, that opens lines of flight rather than establishing systems. A philosophy adequate to a world without transcendence, without foundations, without the illusions of unity and identity. A philosophy that remains to be thought, to be used, to be transformed by those who encounter it. The invitation stands: think, not what you already know how to think, not by applying familiar methods, but by encountering what forces thought, by creating concepts adequate to the encounter, by constructing assemblages that increase power, by finding joy in composition, by staying on the plane of immanence. Deleuze showed it could be done. The task remains.